Okay, live na tayo?
Yes.
Yan. Kamusta, Mark? How are you?
I'm
Nawala ka
good.
daw nung last episode, yung mga fans mo nagalit sa akin.
Hindi ako nakauwi on time. Galing ako sa Cavite. May kasama akong YouTube group, ang tawag Brusco Brothers. Ewan ko kung familiar yung mga audience natin. Mga
Yan
pambata
talaga
na
mga
YouTuber
sikat na
yun eh.
vlogger. Yan
Oh.
talaga mga sikat na vlogger. Di
So
na
I
kami
was late tuloy
ni Atom.
I was excited about that episode. Sayang nga eh.
I know. So unfortunately, we couldn't wait for Atom because he had to do a show right after. So we had to go ahead. But don't worry, guys. Mark is very much still with us. Siya pa yung mas original kaysa sa akin. Today, we also have a very special guest. Guest to discuss very special cases, no? And kaya nga, kasi I think kulang sa analysis natin so far is having really a kind of in-depth legal analysis of issues at hand. So we had all sorts of analysis, but what we need really is legal analysis. And for people to have kind of a legal literacy episode. So ito po yung magiging legal literacy episode namin dun sa mga tao na may tanong, dun sa mga terminologies na ginagamit sa elections, ano yung mga batas na kailangan natin maintindihan. Our guest today is the perfect person to deal with that. So kasama po namin is Attorney Star Elamparo. Is that the correct way? Or Estrella Elamparo? But of course, Star is perfect because siya po ay isang senior partner sa Divina Law, one of the most prestigious law firms in the country. She was one of the top 100 lawyers in the Philippines, according to Asia Business Law Journal in the year 2020 to 2021. So habang may pandemic, may awarding pa rin siguro. Online, Zoom siguro yan. And she was the woman lawyer of the year, according to Asian Legal Business in 2017. Is that correct, Attorney Star?
That's right. Just call me Star, Richard.
Sige po. I mean,
welcome sa Project Pilipinas.
Hi, Mark. Pleased to finally meet you.
Yes, Mark is very, very popular vlogger friend of ours. So.
Yes, and I'm a follower of this podcast. I've been following your episodes from the very beginning.
Wow.
Yes, you're very spirited and lively discussions with your guests.
Ayan, very kind. Magpakabait na ako. Maraming galit sa akin kasi nagka-cut off daw ako. Sorry na. May lag time din kasi gabi na. Alright, so before we go to the meat of the discussion, syempre yun ang style namin sa long-form discussion. Before we go into what you can expect, ano yung mga i-discuss namin, yung mga latest legal developments sa ating election. Of course, there are a number of petitions for disqualification against one of the leading candidates, if not the leading candidates. We're going to discuss all of that. Of course, in a completely objective manner, no? So wag kayong expect dito na we're gonna have a guest who's gonna bash the candidate or not. No, we're gonna do legal literacy today. So please lang, right off the bat, let me just modulate your expectations. So that's what we're gonna do. That's why we have a lawyer with us. But of course, from what we understand, Star, you also have a background in journalism, right? And writing. So I think that makes you quite no offense to other lawyers, but generally lawyers in this country, not abroad, not in the US, are not the best communicators for the lay people, right? For understandable reason. We can debate that later on. But you are one of the leading lawyers and litigators in the country who has been engaged in public education, right? And I think perhaps your background in journalism and being a writer among others has helped you. So can we go back first to your background? Before you became a lawyer, the kind of leading lawyer that you're today, how did you start? What is your background? Can you tell a little bit about yourself?
Yes, like you mentioned, Richard, my undergrad was journalism or communication arts in UP, Diliman. And for a time, I thought that I was going to pursue a career in journalism. I really loved writing, and I was an editor of the Philippine Collegian, the school paper, when I was in college. I also did freelance work while I was in my fourth year of college. But my dad convinced me to take up law and told me that I can always still be a journalist even after law school. So I went to law school, fell in love with the law, with the study of law, and became a legal practitioner afterwards. So I've been in private practice for more than 2 decades already, but I've also worked in government. I've been a public prosecutor of the Department of Justice for about 2 years. And for about 6 years, I was chief legal counsel of the GSIS before I went back again to private practice. I'm now senior partner, as you said, in one of the fastest growing law firms in the country.
If we can remind a little bit, maybe Mark can also come in later. And let's just go back a little bit. Of course, we're not asking age of our guests, especially if they're women. But can you tell us a little bit about the social milieu when you were studying in college? And then also, what was your experience as a law student? What were your expectations? What was the reality? What is the state of legal education in the Philippines, right? Because a lot of my students end up in the law school. We hear a lot of things about law schools. Not everything good, but something's also good. There are also questions as to whether our legal, our law schools are training, putting the right kind of values, because sometimes you can joke we have oversupply of lawyers, undersupply of ethics in this country. Can you tell us a little bit about that? Your take as someone who had a journalism background, if I'm not mistaken, you were a student leader also. Then you go into the law school. What was your impression of legal education in the country?
Well, of course, in UP especially, we are always made socially aware of the realities around us. I was part of the League of Filipino Students, one of the more radical organizations when I was in college. And when I entered law school, I was very lucky that my professors, especially in the first year, were very progressive. So we have actually very progressive professors at the UP College of Law. And therefore, it's not just a matter of studying the letter of the law. We are made to understand the background and the interests that are behind the law, and also the spirit of the law. So it's not just about studying what the law says, but what the law means and how it impacts society, and what we as lawyers can do to use the law as perhaps a weapon to help others and to improve the lives of people.
This is just immediate years after EDSA revolution, right? I mean, just to put things into context.
Yes,
right?
yes.
In fact, I'm just saying the progressive air, the whole zeitgeist, right? Perhaps may explain why you had the kind of progressive legal education that you had, right?
When I was fourth year in high school when the EDSA revolution took place. And when I entered college, the hot issue then was the US bases. We wanted to oust the US bases. In fact, I joined so many rallies, I couldn't count. At the US Embassy, we also had this major rally wherein UP students walked from UP Diliman to Clark Air Base in Pampanga, just to air our sentiments against the US bases. So that was really, it was not like the first quarter storm, but it was also a very, very interesting time to be a student in UP at that time. And so when I entered law school, I had that mindset that I'm not here to protect the interests or to protect the status quo. Perhaps I'm here to study how I can make changes in the status quo. And I think that my 4 years in law school indeed gave me that perspective that sometimes the law serves the interests of privileged few, and therefore we as lawyers are not just meant to preserve the status quo, but also to help society improve the state of the law.
And mga kapanahon mo, again, Mark, you can comment if you want. Parang I'm just deducing. So mga kapanahon mo sila Senator Cayetano, Cheese, mga yun. I mean, I'm trying to just deduce it. They were around this time also.
Kabatch ko si
I'm from
Senator
UP, so
Alan
I kind of
Peter.
know who
Yes.
were yeah, exactly.
Oo. So kabatch ko si Senator Alan Peter Cayetano, tapos si Senator Cheese was a batch ahead of me.
Oh,
so nag-abot kami sa law school.
Star, ito yung star batches ba yan? Is this, parang
lahat
naging very successful.
Senator Kiko Pangilinan was, I think, fourth year when I was first year law school.
Oh, wow, interesting.
Is there he was head of the student council when I was in college.
Is there something you want to tell us about them? I mean, trivia. Sila
Wala naman akong chismis.
Hindi naman tayo marites. Ano lang, just, ano lang, psychoanalysis.
Were you able to meet them during that time, or you just know them lang, or?
Sense
Si
mo ba
Senator
maging senador
Pangilinan.
mga yan or presidential in the future? Mayroon ka bang sense na gano'n with these people?
Meron naman kasi Senator Pangilinan was head of the student council, so he was really very active even during college. Si Senator Cheese naman was the head of their fraternity.
Right.
So they were natural leaders, I suppose.
Leaders, yeah. And Cayetano was also student council leader or something like that?
He was my batchmate, pero Ateneo siya. So hindi ko alam kung anong ginagawa niya sa Ateneo din.
Sa law school, but undergrad, hindi ba?
Law school.
Yeah. But
yes, I think undergrad
UP
siya.
In department, yeah.
Mm-mm.
Right. Mark, do you have any questions on that time? Kasi parang later on, pwede natin balikan kasi kami mga EDSA babies. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about the martial law. Your time as your martial law baby. I'm sorry.
You grew up. I mean, you're from where ba? You're from. Are you from the city or from the province?
Batang Sampaloc ako, Mark. Lumaki ako sa Manila. So,
Yorme din yan. Yorme.
Okay.
Doon ako lumaki sa Sampaloc.
Okay.
In fact, may bahay pa rin kami doon. Doon pa rin nakatira yung family namin.
Can you tell us about your childhood then? Growing up in Sampaloc, was it?
Masaya yung childhood ko. I come from humble beginnings. So sa Sampaloc, nakatira kami. I studied in a public school in Sampaloc. I studied in Ligarda Elementary School. Not sure if Mark is familiar with that. It's a public school. So I'm proud of my beginnings. The school I studied in was one of the best, one of the pilot schools in Manila. And so kilala ko yung Maynila. Dahil dyan talaga ako lumaki. And I lived there until I was a lawyer already. I left Manila when I was a lawyer, when we had to transfer elsewhere.
Mark, may tanong ka ba this is martial law years, right?
So how was your experience studying during that time, during sa martial law years?
Actually, bata pa naman ako, Mark, nung panahon na yan. Kasi I was born 1971. So sinabi ko na yung age ko. So I was really very, very young then. Although, of course, yung aking mga magulang, particularly my dad, was very much a Marcos supporter. So wala kang madidinig na masasamang bagay sa kanya galing tungkol sa martial law. Pero syempre, sa ibang mga kakilala namin, marami ka namang madidinig na mga hindi ring magagandang nangyayari ng martial law. So kami mismo, nung ako naging high school na ako, although I was heavily influenced by my dad, syempre, bilang high school student, I studied in UST at that time. Bilang high school student, namulat na rin ako dun sa mga ibang mga pangyayari, Ferdinand Marcos, at nakita ko rin naman talaga yung paghihirap ng bansa under his rule. Dahil high school na naman ako, naging mulat na ako. And so when EDSA Revolution happened, kasama ako sa nakikisimpatya sa mga who wanted to oust the then President Ferdinand Marcos, especially after the assassination of Ninoy Aquino. Naging aware na talaga din yung mga tao sa mga excesses ng nakaraang Pangulo at pati mga human rights violations. And therefore, yes.
Attorney, can you tell us about when the assassination of Ninoy Aquino happened? I mean, where were you? How did you hear about it? What was your reaction? What was the reaction of people around you? Just give us a sense, kind of a vignette, yun kind of what was happening there on the ground from your perspective.
Well, high school pa kami. So supposedly, hindi pa kami masyadong nakikialam sa mga nangyayari sa lipunan dahil high school pa lang naman. But even then, nakita mo na talagang the public was affected dahil it was all over the news. Nalaman na merong na-assassinate na this political figure. Before, hindi ko pa kilala. Before the assassination, sino ba yung Ninoy Aquino na yan? And so when he was assassinated, it was the news all over. At after the assassination, so shortly after the assassination, naglabasan na yung mga alternative newspapers na tinatawag. So dati ang binabasa namin sa bahay, yung Daily Express, yung mga newspapers or publications that tend to
Censored by
tend
government.
yes, very heavily influenced by government. But then the Philippine Daily Inquirer began publishing. Then thereafter, the Philippine Star, I think. At doon namin nababasa yung mga points of view na contrary to the one espoused by government. So kami mismo, kahit na high school pa lang kami, we were becoming increasingly aware of what was happening at that time. And really the sentiment was overwhelmingly in favor of the ouster of the late Ferdinand Marcos because again, na-highlight na talaga yung mga violations, human rights violations.
Right. This is 3 years before EDSA pa, no? So when EDSA happened,
Yes.
were you surprised or like it was just a matter of time? It was that your understanding?
I'm sorry?
When EDSA happened, few years after that event, were you surprised or parang ano to? It was just a matter of time. Yun ba yung understanding?
I think it was a matter. It was becoming increasingly inevitable because the public sentiment, I mean, based on what I remember, was really increasingly against the government, and sumabay pa na the economic situation at that time was really bad.
Yeah.
So
but not Singapore golden age, hindi ganon, di ba? I mean,
definitely not. I remember that inflation was bad. I remember that the purchasing power of the peso was really bad. So mahirap yung economic situation. So it was, I think, the perfect storm. People have grown increasingly dissatisfied with the performance of the then President Marcos over the years. And parang naging mitya na lang yung pagkamatay ni Ninoy Aquino at that time.
And your sense was, I mean, wasn't there fear na magkakagulo, magkakaroon na anarchy, chaos pag wala na si Marcos? I mean, when someone is in power for 21 years, essentially, everyone is riding the tiger, right? So, once that person is gone, the fear is that you'll descend into anarchy and chaos, as we have seen in many other post-revolutionary contexts. What was the sense then? Did you have a sense that Cory Aquino and her cohorts will be able to shepherd the country through the transition? Was there a fear na mga komunista na malakas pa noon, no, could take over and come to the big cities? It's not that we have many guests who have a very who have a kind of a thorough understanding of those situations. We really look forward to. We really want to see from kind of an eyewitness understanding of that situation. If you could give us a little bit of idea about that, was there?
On the contrary, Richard, I think at that point, yung mga tao, iniisip nila, it couldn't be worse than this. So there wasn't that fear that we would fall into anarchy should we oust this president. Parang punong-puno na yung mga tao at that time na this is the worst that can possibly happen to us. And so things can only get better. In fact, it was the government then, I think, that was trying to propagate that fear na kapag nawala ang kapag hindi ninyo sinuporta tong gobyerno na to, the communists will take over. That was what they were trying to do. But my sense then, the general sentiment was we were all clamoring for change, for another leader, another system of government. Therefore, at that point, parang naging inevitable na yung change of leadership.
And what about after the EDSA revolution? So papunta na, you're transitioning to college already, so you're a mature adult. But those were also very chaotic years, right? Ang daming coup attempts against the Cory Aquino administration. There was the Mendiola massacre. Horrible things were happening. Fascist, proto-fascist group, extreme leftist groups were just shooting each other, probably right and left. So it was really a messy picture, right? And I think, if I'm not mistaken, that was when Lee Kuan Yew of Singapore went to the Philippines and said, your problem is that you have too much democracy, which I think was completely nonsensical, considering this is because all of this mess is inherited from the non-democratic. But anyway, I took issue with Lee Kuan Yew really on that, but God bless his soul. But going back to that, can you give us an idea about that, the kind of messy, semi-anarchic situation, especially in places like Manila? You have the Mendiola massacre, all of these things. Were you aware of these things? Obviously, papunta ka ng UP, di ba? Eventually, so I suppose may social consciousness ka naman. And you have high school students protesting in Thailand and other countries. So, I think once you are 14 and above in many countries, activism comes naturally to a lot of people.
Right. After the EDSA revolution happened and Cory was put into power and became president, there was so much hope. I mean, the euphoria was there. There was so much hope that she would make fundamental changes. She would implement fundamental changes, and she would somehow address all the ills of society. Of course, that was an unfair expectation because one leader cannot possibly do that. But because a revolutionary government was put in place, the expectation was so high that she would be able to make sweeping fundamental changes in society. So when that did not happen, and in fact, shortly, the honeymoon period wasn't that long eh. So nangyari yung Mendiola Massacre, tapos marami ring napapabalitang mga human rights violations nung panahon ni Cory. In fact, yung mga tinatawag nilang CAFGU, yung mga civilian, yes, militia. Yes, nauso siya nung panahon ni Cory. And a lot of people, in fact, there were statistics being shown that parang dumami pa yung human rights violations. Nung panahon ni President Cory Aquino. Of course, I had no way of verifying
right?
it.
Yeah, I mean, just
Possibly.
to be fair to her, I mean, we're not saying that she was more, but I mean, the point is that order was kind of up in the air because the armed force of the Philippines was not clearly under her completely, right?
Right, and there were coups left and right.
Yeah, that had to wait until Ramos.
There was pressure from, I think, from both the left and the right. She was under pressure from the left, and she was also under extreme pressure from the right because of the coups that were happening at that time. So it was not a very ideal situation for her. Yes, so it wasn't a perfect scenario after post-EDSA. There were a lot who were very disappointed with how the new president handled the situation. Many think that she was not able to take advantage of the golden opportunity that was handed to her, especially during that time when she had that revolutionary government. And then we had this constitution, the 1987 constitution, which a lot of people thought was less than ideal. So that's what happened, and people were likewise dissatisfied with the way that agrarian reform was implemented. It wasn't the agrarian reform that many had thought would happen.
And the Luisita, right? I mean,
and Hacienda Luisita happened. Yes. So it wasn't the ideal scenario that people were expecting for.
Mark, do you have a question on this era, on the Cory era? Is there something that you think we have to discuss? Because we kind of touched on that with Leloy, no? But Leloy was very much into the whole Hacienda Luisita issue, right? Is there something about the Cory era that you think maybe our audience have to know a little bit more about from kind of an informed eyewitness, right? But of course, Star, we're also here transitioning to the fall of Berlin Wall and end of Cold War. So indeed, very interesting times, right? That you came, I mean, the era that you came of age, right, was also, a huge moment, right, in human history, right? So the fall of Berlin Wall and then end of Cold War. And then ito, mga activists, were you part of that, pushing for the US bases to be removed from the Philippines. But of course, there were many who were not happy with that, including Cory. I think Ramos also had reservations because the idea was that, well, tapos na yung Soviet threat, but we may have other threats, including from an emerging China. But for some reason, it seems people were too caught up with the whole nationalistic post-Cold War peace dividend discourse that they kind of ignore that. And I'm sorry, I'm saying that because that's really my area, right? West Philippines and South China Sea. And as much as I'm a patriot, I love us to be independent. I think we have to also be realistic about the geopolitical realities on the ground. Just to put things into context, once we kick out the Americans, the Singaporeans invite them under a similar argument. That's Singapore. It's not.
It's good to ask then, attorney, if like yung ngayon with what's happening ngayon dun sa ating West Philippine Sea and all that. So, do you still think of it that way?
Pinagsisihan ko ba?
Yeah,
Yung
no. I mean,
pag-oppose ko sa
We're not
US
saying that.
bases. Yeah.
It's up to you. But for someone who
of
was
course,
involved in kicking out
there
the
are pros and
American,
cons, of course.
right.
Pero
Right.
do you still think it was the best thing to do at that time, or?
Okay. At that time, kasi our main reason for opposing the US bases was we believe that the existence of the bases, it was being used, the bases were being used as springboards for intervention by the United States. So habang nandyan yung mga base militar, meron silang paraan para makialam sa ating mga internal affairs. And we didn't want to be dictated upon or influenced so much by a foreign interest, by a foreign government as far as our affairs are concerned. So naniniwala pa rin ako that should still be the case, that as much as possible, we should not allow a foreign government to intervene in our affairs, whether that purpose was served by the ousting of the US bases. I think so, to a certain extent. Dahil wala na sila sa shores natin. But at the same time, I do believe that we need the help and cooperation of other countries, of other powers. So also to protect our interests, like now in the West Philippine Sea, kinakailangan nating ng mga allies in the United States and in other countries para labanan yung mga plano ng China na pagkimkim ng ating mga territories. Yes.
You think you underestimated China, or was that an aspect like that? Because let me put this into context. So Cold War ended, it had huge impact in Europe. The Berlin Wall fell. But much didn't change here in Asia. The Korean division was still there. North Korea, South Korea was still there. US bases stayed in Japan, in South Korea, right across the region, because many countries in the region were not too triumphalist yet. Parang wait lang, hinay muna tayo. But in the Philippines, it seems we were feeling like we're like in Europe, right? Like tapos na wala. Let's kick out the Americans because there's no need for them here. They're just going to be attraction of problem rather than defense, and then boom,
right.
Mischief rift happening within few years. So clearly, some friends in Beijing were watching what was happening.
Well, those are things that you realize on hindsight, right? Dahil at that time, the threat from China wasn't as imminent or present as it is now. But I do believe that with or without the US bases, we have a mutual defense treaty that we can invoke just in case China makes a move. So hindi naman kinakailangan din na merong US bases dito para tulungan tayo ng United States. So in that regard, that kind of move or that kind of reaction on the part of the Philippines maybe was called for at that time. Kasi there were fears of, at that time, merong Cold War pa na tinatawag, diba? Na baka mas magiging prone tayo to danger if we have US bases here. But of course, the reality now is different. So hindi natin ma-assess yung rightness or wrongness of that move.
Mark, do you have a question over that period before we transition into?
Yeah, okay na. Let's.
So, Attorney Star, so you work in the government right after you finish university. So
no,
first of all, your training was. You were saying it was progressive, right? Back then, your professors were people who were really socially engaged, not just teaching you law to be big shot law firm people, right? But it's like no offense, I'm just saying, right? Yeah.
I actually, I had wanted to work in an NGO after law school, but I then talked to a lot of practitioners before I graduated from law. And I was told, because the field that I wanted to enter was litigation, really. I didn't want to go into corporate law or tax practice or anything else. And I was advised by a lot of the practitioners I spoke to that if I really wanted to go into law practice or litigation, that I should enter a law firm, because that's where I will get exposed to the best possible training. And so I listened. I said, okay, I'll go to a law firm, private law firm, and try to learn as much as I can, and then decide what I would want to do with my life afterwards. So I entered a private law firm at that time. The law firm of attorney Mario Unquico, who was one of the best litigation lawyers at that time, also a lawyer of Cory Aquino. I learned a lot. I after 2 years, I transferred. I was able to handle, in fact, many high-profile cases when I was with his law firm. My first year of practice, I was made to handle the Hubert Webb case. I don't know if you're familiar. That was yes. I was, in fact, I had not yet passed the bar. I was assigned by attorney Mario Unquico to co-handle that case with him. And so that was really my baptism of fire. Hindi ka aware dun sa Hubert Webb case?
Hindi mo alam yung Richard?
Kunyari, hindi ko alam. Hindi ko alam talaga.
There was this Visconde Massacre.
Visconde.
It was called the crime of the century at that time, or the case of the century. Anyway, for a long time, the Visconde Massacre remained unsolved. And after several years, they charged a group of young men. One of them was Hubert Webb, who was the son of former Senator Freddie Webb.
Documentary about that. Yeah,
yes, there was a documentary, and we were hired by Senator Webb to defend Hubert, and also one of the other accused, the son of the actress Pinky De Leon, si Tony Boy Lejano. So we were defending two of the accused in that case, and it was the trial of the century. So it was an everyday hearing for us. So I got exposed right away to the rigors of trial work. And just to give closure to that story, I left the firm, but eventually we know that Hubert Webb and the rest of the accused were acquitted of the charge several years later. Anyway, so I transferred to another private law firm, and after a while I decided I wanted to be a public prosecutor. Or a fiscal.
You felt that you can better serve the public? Is that?
Yes, I wanted to do public service. I would attend hearings all the time, and I would be amazed at how public prosecutors, private lawyers would go to court, attend the hearing for one client. Public prosecutors would be attending one hearing for like 20 or 30 cases.
Yeah.
So can you imagine the kind of workload the public prosecutor has? So a public prosecutor handles the case for the government, as you know, and basically ang kliyente ng public prosecutor yung private complainant. Usually ito yung mga private complainant na walang pambayad sa isang private lawyer. So umaasa sila sa fiscal o sa private prosecutor na mag-prosecute ng kaso nila. And so I entered the prosecutorial service. I was a fiscal in Manila for 1 year. I still look back at that short stint at the prosecutor's office as probably the best year of my career. It was a very, very fulfilling. After that, I became state prosecutor with the Department of Justice. And after that, I went back to private practice, and then I took my master's. And after I took my master's, I became chief legal counsel of GSIS. And after GSIS, that's when I transferred to Divina Law, where I am now.
What was your experience with working in the public sector as a litigator? What were the things you realized with our judicial institutions, with how justice is dispensed or not dispensed, and what were the bottlenecks? What were the points of improvement, perhaps over time? How did you try to help to improve the situation in your own capacity?
Okay. That was when I realized how unfortunate it is if you are accused in our courts. Dahil nung na-assign ako sa isang court in Manila, and this was in Manila, nung na-assign ako dun sa isang judge, I found out that a lot of the accused in his sala, ilang taon nang nakakulong, yung iba doon nakakulong na for a long time, na mas matagal pa sa maximum penalty for the crime with which they're charged. Halimbawa, ang charge is simple. Yes,
Yeah.
about simple snatching. Wala pang 6 na buwan ang sentensya diyan, ang penalty for simple snatching. Pero yung iba doon nakakulong na for 3 years. Simply because hindi pa natatapos yung kaso nila sa loob ng 3 taon at wala silang pera para mag-post ng bail or para magpiyansa. And these are not isolated incidents. Maraming kaso na gano'n na yung pagkakakulong nila ay mas mahaba na doon sa maximum penalty for the offense for which they are charged. So kung yung public prosecutor at yung public attorney, kung public attorney man yung humahawak ng kaso for the accused, will not point out to the judge na judge, actually yung sentensya niya, yung maximum sentence dito, mas mahaba na yung panahon na nakakulong siya. If that is not pointed out, then walang mangyayari. Nakakulong pa rin yung tao dahil hindi naman alam ng tao na pwede na pala siyang lumaya. So as soon as I was assigned to a court in Manila, yun talaga yung ginawa ko. Nilinis ko yung caseload ko ng mga kaso na kung saan dapat matagal nang lumaya yung akusado simply because na-exceed na nung detention nila, length of detention nila, yung maximum penalty for their imprisonment. It should be automatic, right? One of the things that shocked me at that time is it should be automatic. The court should somehow be alerted by the jail warden or by whomever na actually po na-exceed niya na yung maximum penalty for the offense for which he is being tried. But it wasn't happening that way. So, at maraming kaso na alam natin, nabibinbin dahil nagpapapuspon, walang testigo, walang abogado. So therefore, umaabot na ng 5 taon yung kaso at hindi nakapiyansa yung akusado, whereas napaka-petty lang nung offense niya, napakaliit lang nung penalty para dun sa offense. So there were these many cases, and I hope that I was able to somehow make a dent dahil dun sa kote ko talaga nilinis ko talaga yung mga kaso na gano'n na masyado ng mahabang nakakulong. And you can really see na yung mga akusado and then that their families were very thankful na napalaya na sila at na nakaalis na sa kulungan just because the attention of the court was called to the fact that they can already be released. At isang kote lang yung pinag-uusapan natin. Can you imagine, Richard and Mark? Can you imagine ilang kote natin sa buong bansa, ilang sala, ilang branches ng court sa buong bansa, and this is happening. So it's really mind-boggling. And I don't know if there is now a system na napakasimpleng bagay that the court should be alerted kung kailan nag-i-exceed na yung imprisonment or yung detention ng akusado.
Attorney, can you tell us what do you think is what are the contributing factors? I don't want to use the word root because it's multiple factors contributing here dito sa institutional deficiencies na nakita natin sa ating judicial institutions. For me, of course, mahalaga yan because doon ko na-pinpoint saan galing yung charisma ni Pangulong Duterte doon sa kanyang tinatawag na penal populism because maraming tao nawalan ng pag-asa doon sa ating mga normal institutional judicial processes, no? Dahil kaya nga kung we have one of the highest pre-trial detainees rates in the world, our jails are the most congested on earth or number 2 depending on what. I mean, some of the numbers are just mind-boggling, right? I think there are more people are pre-trial detainees than people are being convicted in jail. And lahat sila sinama-sama. Meron pa mga juveniles na nilagay dyan together with adults, and many horrific things happened there. No, they were abused, they were influenced in a negative way. So it's just a horror story, right? If we look at the deficiency in judicial institutions, anong basa mo doon based on your experience and studying the situation and reflecting upon it throughout the years?
Well, sa aking pagkakaalam, after I left the prosecutorial service, marami rin na rin naging reforms. Pero when I was there, it was really the lack of system. Walang sistema, walang mga processes by which the disposition of cases can be facilitated. And also, apart from the lack of system or processes, na-sense ko rin yung apathy. apathy,
Pag mas mahihirap yung mga tao, para may feudalistic.
yes, oo.
Let's
Kung
just
if
be honest
nobody
about it.
will take up the cudgels, kung walang
Right.
mag-iingay, hindi tatama rin yung public defender, tatama rin din yung public prosecutor, yung judge din naman walang pakialam kung hindi kinol yung attention niya. Hindi ko naman nilalahat. But there are these cases na makikita mo parang apathetic din talaga yung mga players in the administration of justice, and exacerbated by the lack of a system or the proper processes for facilitating the disposition of cases. At ang masama nito, alam naman natin yung estado ng ating mga kulungan, diba? So, sa halip na nare-reform ang ating mga akusado, especially for menial offenses, alam mo, marami din sa mga kaso na hinahandle, especially ng municipal trial courts or metropolitan trial courts, bagansya. Bagansya, if you know what. Yes, very petty crimes. These people are not even criminals. Bagansya is basically criminalization of poverty. Bagansya is makita kang pakalat-kalat sa kalye, meaning wala kang bahay. So pwede kang kasuhan ng tambay-tambay, yes. So sa halip na mare-reform yung mga offenders or suspected offenders, mas talo silang napapasama sa loob ng kulungan dahil they're mixed with the other personalities there, the other criminals, at ang kondisyon sa loob ng kulungan ay kung makikita mo lang, hindi ka makakatulog talaga.
Netflix, National Geographic. Andun yun, di ba? Yung mga worst, mga
documented na yan.
Scariest
Documented.
Yeah.
Right. So hindi conducive yung ating sistema, at least at the time that when I was still there. I hope that reforms have been made to change that. Although I'm not very, very optimistic.
If I may give some numbers, for our audience to have an idea of this, because I had to write a book chapter after giving a talk at Harvard Law School a few years ago. So I had to really research on this issue. Saan galing itong penal populist charisma ni Pangulong Duterte? Bakit maraming tao it seems they're not too aghast by the vigilante justice that President Duterte has been propounding for years. So just to put things in context, there's only one court for every 50,000 Filipinos. Lower courts grapple with an average of 4,000 cases daily. That means a single judge is responsible for 644 cases a year. Yung ating penitentiary system, Philippine prisons are struggling with average overcapacity of close to 400%, right? Some prisons, it could be at 2,000%, so 20 times more than the maximum capacity. So inhumane conditions, including for pretrial detainees, and close to 64% of the inmates now, which now includes actually one senator of the Republic, right? Let's just be clear about that, are actually pretrial detainees, I think, which is the second worst rate on earth. So either first or second at the very bottom, in terms of conditions of our penitentiary and judicial institutions. These numbers are shocking. These numbers are actually 2018-19. Under President Duterte, there has been some improvement in terms of increasing the budget of the judiciary, which is just barely at 1% of the entire budget of the government. So I'm not saying this is just a matter of money, because when I raised the issue of budget, former Chief Justice Sereno, we were in a panel together in UP Public Act. She said, no, I increased the money. But we know, as you mentioned a while ago, it's really a combination of many factors, a kind of a feudalistic mindset, whereby people from poorer backgrounds, they tend to be neglected, institutional and individual, unfortunately. Again, not all, but we are talking about trend lines, general characteristics. At yun nga and of course, capacity building is another issue. Constantly training your lawyers, your judges, providing them protection. If I'm not mistaken, Mocha Uson's father was a judge in Pangasinan who I think was killed allegedly by some of the criminals that his court was trying to investigate. So, you have these really shocking personal stories that changes the individual trajectory of some people, including Mocha Uson, I think that's where galing yung kanyang very, I would say, almost sincere, passionate support for President Duterte, at least back in the days, because of the horrific things that happened to his father. I'm just saying that this is a crisis that for some reason people are not paying attention to. Everyone thinks about who will be the next president, who's the next senator, but it matters who are our judges, who's there in the Supreme Court, how courts are doing, because in a system when there's no justice, even if you have the best president and senator, the faith of people in democracy, in the entire system, will be corroded, right? And corrupt politicians can just keep on doing what they're doing. And for some reason, yun ang hindi ko naintindihan, bakit hindi binibigyan ng sapat na attention itong issue ng crisis sa ating judicial institutions. We're not saying everyone is corrupt and all. We're not saying that. But I think you talk to any honest judge, they'll tell you there is a problem there. Capacity building, under capacity, overloaded, budget kulang, walang protection, danger. And for some reason, none of our top candidates for presidency, among others, have really made this one of their central issues. Duterte did it, but he just touched the symptom. He didn't touch the root of the problem, right? He talked about, why we need vigilante kasi hindi gumagana, right? But he didn't talk about why hindi gumagana yung due process. That's why I felt na kailangan natin erase yan, attorney, and I think those numbers are really put things into perspective. I understand very well why people are so frustrated with quote-unquote democracy, because this is what they see. It's constant injustice system, as the late Carlos Celdran put it. Yeah,
I totally agree. It doesn't seem like a sexy issue to be part of, to be central to any candidate's platform. Pero napakahalaga niyan dahil ang daming hindi lang yung mga akusado kundi mga pamilya ng mga akusado, yung mga biktima at mga pamilya ng mga biktima. Kung bibilangin natin yan, that's a big part of our population. And a lot of these people a lot of the ones who are victimized, the ones who are detained, mga kabataan. So titignan mo ano nang kinabukasan nila kung ang kanilang kabataan are spent in jail and justice is not administered properly, maraming kinabukasan na nasisira na agad.
Yeah. Mark,
itatanong, yun din ang gusto kong malaman din eh. Bakit yung mga trials sa atin take so long? Why does it sometimes take 3 years, 5 years, and ano yung pwedeng gawin to maybe shorten yung...
Ito na lang, Mark.
Yung iba, convicted na, ilang beses na. Doon pa rin sila tumatakbo pa for highest office.
Oo, dahil sobrang tagal ng mga kaso. Two things. Postponements. So maraming dahilan for postponements. Nagkasakit yung abogado, hindi makarating yung witness, nagkasakit ang witness, nagkasakit si judge, may seminar si judge. Nagkasakit yung kabilang abogado.
Nag-neck brace.
Oo. Yes. So imaginein mo na lang, every time na mapopostpone yung kaso, ang next setting, halimbawa nag-postpone kami, may hearing ako bukas. Kapag nagpo-postpone ako sa hearing ko bukas, ang next setting nun, next year na. January or February. Tapos, kung nagkataon sa next hearing na yon, may sakit naman yung kabilang party or merong another excuse, hindi rin matutuloy. Ang next setting nun, 4 months thereafter. At kaya naman ganun katagal yung mga settings is napakadaming kaso na nakakalendar. So patong-patong na, punong-puno na talaga yung kalendaryo ng mga korte. Kaya hindi na-accommodate yung kahit gustuhin ko man yung continuous trial na tinatawag, hindi nangyayari yun kasi masyadong punong-puno na nga kalendaryo ng mga korte. So the solution I think is to develop a system para mas mabilis ang pag-dispose ng mga kaso, but also to add branches to our courts, to add judges, to add salas. Kasi meron talagang mga korte na pag pumunta ka, ang nakakalendaryo sa isang umaga is 40, 50. Paano mo matatapos sa isang umaga yung ganung kadaming kaso? It's really impossible.
No, average per year, per judge. No, I mean, that's crazy.
Right. So halimbawa kahit na ako, hindi absent walang absent dun sa kaso ko, pareho kaming ready nung kabilang counsel, magpipresenta ako ng witness, pero pag nakaka 30 minutes na yung witness ko, sasabihin na ni judge counsel, can we continue your witness's testimony to the next hearing because I have 30 other cases scheduled for today. So hindi ka na makakahindi kahit na nasa gitna ka na ng examination ng witness mo, in consideration of the fact na yung judge nakiusap dahil may 30 kaso pa siyang i-hear that morning, marireset na naman yung kaso mo. So this is an intractable problem na has been there for since the beginning. Hindi ko alam kung ano na ang pwedeng solusyon, pero nakikita kong pinakamadali magdagdag ng West. Magdagdag ng branches.
Is this problem mostly sa mga urban cities or pati sa probinsya ganun din ba kagrabe, or mostly dito lang kunyari Metro Manila, kung saan sobrang daming tao, sobrang daming mga kaso din?
I believe na na mas pronounced tong problema na to sa mga urbanized cities like Manila, like Metro Manila, at saka kahit na yung Cebu, Davao, yung mga urbanized areas all over the country. Meron din naman akong mga napuntahan na lugar na kokonti ang kaso. Halimbawa, pumunta ako sa Batanes. Kinuwento sa akin nung judge doon na 4 lang yung kaso na hinahandle niya. Can you imagine yung disparity? 4 cases lang. Oo. Yung tipong nag-away lang during alasingan, yun lang yung kaso niya. Pag na-resolve yun, hindi nga daw niya tinatapos kasi pag na-resolve, pag na-resolve, wala na raw siyang kaso. So, merong ganong klaseng disparity na perhaps need to be addressed para lang
para lang So how about kasi yung sa pandemic, dun sa pandemic, parang we got to see na yung sa mga court hearings through Zoom. Is it
yes.
Is it possible ba na, like, for example, maluwag si judge dito sa ganitong sa Batanes. So maybe he could hear other cases from possibly bang anong naging experience dun sa paggamit ng technology ngayon like Zoom for hearings?
Baka pwede hologram. Hologram na.
Hologram. Meta.
Yeah,
pero I mean,
Enrile, Mang Johnny, hindi makapunta sa mag-hologram kami.
Pero
na-realize actually namin nung time ng pandemic, 'di ba? Dapat yung mga hearings in person 'yan. Hindi pa ginagamitan talaga ever ng online technology yung hearings. Pero nung pandemic, napilitan na gawing online using Zoom. Yes. Napilitan na gawing Zoom and we realized na as long as reliable yung Wi-Fi connection, as long as reliable yung internet connection, pwede talaga siyang gawin eh.
Pwede, no?
It saves time for everybody. Mas maraming nare-resolve na kaso dahil yung mga testigo hindi na kailangan mag-travel, mas konti ang pwedeng excuse.
Pati US Supreme Court cases, di ba? Nakita ko, they're doing it over Zoom, di ba? I mean, I've seen the footages. I mean, that's incredible. I mean, if that is our...
That's a good, pwede makabawas nga talaga ng at least ng mga...
Pwede makabawas, Mark, pero ang naging problema kung minsan talaga, yung mahinang internet connection. So sa halip na matutuloy yung kaso, kahit ready lahat, dahil sa hindi magkarinigan, dahil choppy yung signal, nare-reset. So, it would be a good alternative kung reliable yung internet connection.
Sabotage ko niya. Hello. Yung mga ganun kunyari, hindi narinig.
Alam mo, naisip ko yung Richard ko minsan na baka mamaya excuse lang. Pero, yun. That's a downside.
Yes. I mean, like, there have been sorry, Mark, for cutting off. I mean, there have been studies to suggest na judges tend to give harsher sentences kung minsan overloaded sila or iba yung time. So, kunyari, before lunch and after lunch, there was a study done in one of the countries that showed mas marahas yung mga sentensya na binibigay ng judges. Pag yung timing ng court case mo ay mali, di ba? Either it's before lunch na gutom na or medyo pa evening na. I mean, I'm just telling you that judges are human beings. Let's not forget that. So sometimes there is some discretion room, for the judges once someone is found guilty, and they might go for a more maximal punishment than a minimal one kung talagang pagod sila, overloaded sila, or maling timing. So this issue of overload and capacity building, I think, is really central, if not existential, to deal with the judicial crisis that we have in this country, which for some reason no one is calling. I mean, we have so many lawyers. No one talks about this, the institutional problem in the judicial system in the Philippines. May dadagdag ka ba, Mark, dun sa issue na yan, yung sa kakulangan sa mga korte?
Hindi, kasi yung yung experience ko na kasi sa vlogging,
right.
I've covered yung mga high profile na cases. So the very recent one that I covered, I went all the way to Tarlac, yung sa kala Nuesca, 'di ba? Yung viral video, yung shot yung mag-ina sa Tarlac, yung
yes.
Kasi that was a very big issue that time, so I covered it sa vlog and yung sa trial, so I was able to cover it. Parang it took them only, I think, 7 months from the start to hanggang ma-convict yung suspect, 'di ba? Pero ang sinasabi nga sa akin, yun daw sobrang bilis daw yun. For lalo na criminal case na ganun. Pag sa iba daw, pag hindi high profile or ano, it would last 3 years, 4 years pa, papahabain nung people involved siguro or ano.
Well, that's exceptional, Mark. I agree. Yung 7 months na yun, sobrang bilis nun. Siguro either talagang minadali din ng judge dahil alam niya na high profile at marami nag-aabang dun sa kaso, or sadyang kukonti yung kaso na hinahandle ng judge na yun, although I doubt it. So pag high profile yung kaso, mas nabibigyan ng pansin siguro ng media, kaya mas napapadali. But most of the cases are never covered by the media, diba? Yung mga pangkaraniwang kaso, and those are the ones that languish.
So now let's go to the meat of the discussion. Not that hindi meaty enough. Now let's go to the elections. First of all, Attorney, are there like some general misconceptions about the legal architecture of elections that you think we have to correct, or are there issues that you think we have to clarify, certain terminologies that you realize the media is not explaining properly or average people are not very aware of? Ikaw, Mark, dun sa mga nakikita mo online, ano yung mga confusion, ano yung mga technical terms, mga legal issues na sa tingin mo na mahalaga na i-clarify natin today with our guest?
Like yung sa elections ngayon, ano?
Yeah, generally. I mean, like, ano yung substitution rules, ano yung disqualification.
Siguro i-ask din natin.
Can we go through one by one? Yeah.
Yung like I said kanina, yung sa disqualification and cancellation. Kasi I just recently found out na magkaiba pala yun. Na iba pala yung disqualification case, iba pala yung cancellation case. So, can you explain to us, Attorney, yung pinagkaiba ng dalawang yon?
Yung unang binanggit mo, Mark, is petition for disqualification. So sa ilalim ng batas ng Omnibus Election Code, merong mga grounds kung bakit disqualified ang isang tao para maging kandidato. Disqualified siya if he doesn't have the qualifications for the position that he's applying for. Example, halimbawa, somebody who's running for president who's below 40 years old is disqualified. Kasi sa ilalim ng ating batas, ng saligang batas natin, kailangan at least 40 years old para makatakbo bilang Pangulo. At least 35 years old para makatakbo bilang senador, at least 25 years old para makatakbo bilang congressman. So kung kulang ka sa mga qualifications, ang tamang petition na ifa-file sa COMELEC ay petition for disqualification. Kung disqualified ka. Tinatawag naman nating petition for cancellation ng certificate of candidacy kapag merong misrepresentation doon sa certificate of candidacy mo. Yung certificate of candidacy, yan yung papeles o dokumento na fina-file ng isang gustong tumakbo sa eleksyon. At may mga nakasaad na certain facts doon. Halimbawa, nakalagay doon natural born citizen siya, nakalagay doon resident siya ng Pilipinas for so many years, o nakalagay doon, tinatanong din kasi doon if you have been previously convicted of a crime. Pag sinabi mo doon, syempre na hindi ka pa convicted of a crime involving moral turpitude or of a crime that carries with it a penalty of more than 18 months,
right.
Which is a disqualification. Pag sinabi mo na, pag nagsabi ka ng hindi ka makatotohanan doon sa certificate of candidacy mo, ang petition na ifa-file naman ay petition for cancellation.
So the second is a question of misrepresentation, right?
Misrepresentation. Oo.
Yung first is
misrepresentation.
Tama
absence of qualification.
Qualifications.
Absence of qualification, yes. Pero alam mo, the distinction between the two, medyo technical siya, at kung minsan sinasantabi din siya ng ating mga korte. Like naalala ko nung panahon that we filed the petition for disqualification kay Senator Grace Poe when she was running for president. Some of the petitioners, ang ginawa nila petition for cancellation. I think mine was a petition for cancellation of certificate of candidacy. Another petitioner, I think, used a petition for disqualification, and the COMELEC took cognizance of both. And both cases went all the way to the Supreme Court. So sometimes it becomes a mere technicality that can be ignored by the COMELEC or by the courts. Although nakasaad sa batas natin na kapag nag-file ka ng petition for cancellation, tapos ang dapat pala ay disqualification, pwedeng i-dismiss yung cancellation and vice versa. But yun na nga, in practice, parang hindi ganun ka-stricto din ang COMELEC.
Right. What about the substitution issue? Because I mean, I saw Resolution 10 for 20 September 2018. Parang sobrang flexible yata until midday ng election. Parang pwede ka mag-replace kung paras kayo ng family name. And then, because many people are saying November 15 is the day, but actually under some circumstances will fit until the election day. Can we have a clarification on that? Do we have fixed interpretations by COMELEC of the substitution rules? To what degree does the COMELEC have a discretion to adopt more flexible or sometimes more restrictive interpretation of the omnibus election code? I mean, I think people have to understand that siguro this is law, diba? It's a matter of institutional and individual interpretation too. No? It's not as clear-cut perhaps as people think, right?
Sa ilalim ng batas natin, COMELEC kasi yung nag-set ng deadlines for the different processes sa election. So even the substitution, yung period ng substitution, COMELEC ang nag-set ng deadline. And for this particular elections, ang alam natin, November 15. So nagkakaroon ng substitution for under 3 instances. So the first instance is death of the candidate. Halimbawa, matapos na mag-file ng certificate of candidacy ng isang kandidato, namatay siya. Therefore, yung political party to which he belongs has the right to substitute him with another candidate.
Or coalition, right? Because I saw
coalition.
Party or coalition. Yeah.
Yes. Basta rehistrado sa COMELEC. And then the second ground for substitution is the disqualification of a candidate. Halimbawa, before the deadline set by COMELEC, na-disqualify yung unang candidate na inihain ng isang political party. Again, the same political party will have the right to substitute that disqualified candidate with another candidate. And then the third instance is a withdrawal, voluntary withdrawal ng naunang kandidato. So again, the political party can substitute another person for that candidate who withdrew his candidacy. Nilinaw ng Supreme Court ito sa isang kaso, yung Federico versus COMELEC, dahil nga may mga instances na pinapayagan na until midday of the election day itself, pwedeng mag-substitute ang isang kandidato sa another candidate. Sabi ng Supreme Court na same family name. Ang sabi ng Supreme Court, pwede lamang yon yung up to midday of the elections kapag ang ground ay death or disqualification ng papalitang candidate. Hindi siya pwede in cases of voluntary withdrawal.
So November 15 na yun?
Yung voluntary withdrawal hanggang November 15 lang talaga. So the substitution that can happen from now until midday of the elections would only be under 2 grounds, disqualification and death of the candidate that you wish to substitute. And pwede lamang ito if the candidate belongs to the same political party. Hindi pwede to para sa mga independent candidates. Kasi wala namang nape-prejudice sa political party kung ikaw ay independent candidate, so walang substitution doon. At pangalawa, yung sa midday of the elections na substitution, dapat same surname as the substituted candidate. Magkapareho kayo dapat ng apelido. Bakit? Kasi at that point, hindi na pwedeng palitan yung balota. Na-print na yung balota. So, last name na nung papalitan mong kandidatong nakalagay doon. So therefore, pwede ka lang mag-substitute kung pareho kayo ng last name. Kahit na hindi kayo magkamag-anak. So kahit na strangers. Yes.
So who can choose like, kunyari, sabi natin, Marcos kung sinong Marcos pwede mag-replace? Paano ba yun?
Hindi. It's the political party.
Party will
the political party,
Yun yung difference nung cancellation and disqualification, di ba? Pag disqualification, pwedeng substitute. Kapag cancellation, walang
hindi
substitute.
Na pwede. Kasi wala kang, in effect, pag na-cancel yung certificate of candidacy nung nauna, in effect, walang valid na candidate na isa-substitute. Right. Kasi hindi valid yung certificate of candidacy.
To begin with.
So, disqualified is better for the enemy. Para, I'm sorry.
No, cancellation is better.
For
cancellation
the enemy,
is
wala
better.
Na talaga. Like,
for this case nga kay Bongbong, kung ma-disqualify lang siya, papalit si Amy, papalit si...
Exactly.
Yung wife or
pero kung
man.
gusto mo root and branch na tanggalin, i-cancel mo na agad. Parang divorce versus annulment, di ba? Parang may pagkaganon, di ba? Annulment yung parang from the very beginning, annulling the I get
Kasi
that.
ngayon,
And that's why
Okay, attorney.
And that's why, Mark, I think that's why the second case that was filed, yung sinampa ni Attorney Ted Te, it was not a petition for disqualification, but a petition for cancellation of COC. Yung nauna kasi disqualification.
Mark, can you just, before we go, because this is very complicated na once we go to this disqualification issue. Before that, Attorney, can you tell us a lot about this nuisance candidate thing? Because parang ang daming nag-apply to run for the presidency. How can you say someone is a nuisance or not? What is the basis of COMELEC? I think COMELEC is right. COMELEC has the mandate to do that. But ano yung base nila? Baka sabi na iba, discrimination lang yan. Dahil hindi lang mayaman or kilala na pamilya, nuisance candidate na agad. How is that done? What is the jurisprudence around that?
Well, sa batas naman natin, malinaw yung grounds to declare somebody as a nuisance candidate. Yung una, kung sumali lamang sa, nag-file lamang ng kandidatura yung tao na yun to mock the election processes. Yun ang word ng batas, to mock the election processes.
What does that mean? What do you mean to mock the election process?
Ibig sabihin, wala naman talaga siyang
balak na tumakbo.
Seryosong interes, na tumakbo para sa opisina na yan. Gusto lamang niyang guluhin yung proseso ng eleksyon, kaya siya ay sumali. Pangalawa, if yung pagsali niya ay makaka-cause ng confusion sa mga voters dahil yung pangalan niya ay kaparehong-kapareho ng isang existing candidate. Halimbawa, merong isang sikat na candidate at para mabawasan ng boto yung candidate na yan at magkaroon ng confusion, hindi malaman kung kanino ibibilang yung boto ng tao, merong isang kapangalan o katulad ng pangalan niya ang sasali. So alam naman natin, yes, para isabotahe lamang pagkaraniwan yung candidacy ng mas kilalang kandidato. And the third sinasabi na yung mga tao na wala naman talaga under the circumstances na, case-to-case basis yan evaluate ng COMELEC, under the circumstances at makikita mo namang walang bona fide intent to run for office. So yung mga tinatawag nating mga quote-unquote placeholders, yung alam natin na nagsampa lang for the purpose of saving a slot for somebody else. Although napaka-subjective niyan because sasabihin ng kandidato, who are you to question my good faith and my interest in running? Gusto ko naman talagang tumakbo.
Senator of the Republic.
Senator ba to?
Yes. Yes.
Factor din ba dyan yung yung resources ng tao? Kasi kunyari I want to run for president, wala ka namang kahit a few millions makinarya or maski pera man lang o a few millions man lang to run. So tinitingnan din ba yun ng COMELEC pag to check if nuisance candidate yung
Maaari rin siya maging factor, Mark, kasi kung wala ka namang makinarya to at least be known to majority of the voters of the population at talagang masasabi mong imposible na ikaw ay manalo dito sa election na to dahil sa absence of machinery or funds or resources, pwede ka rin i-declare na nuisance candidate. Kasi masasabi rin na how can you be serious in your candidacy kung wala kang ganitong resources. Hindi naman kinakailangang maging mayaman ka or you belong to a prominent family or to have a very big political party, but at the very least, decent enough resources siguro to mount a campaign.
Attorney, isn't that contradictory? Because if you look at it, there are countries whereby you cannot run for parliament unless may master's ka or graduate degrees. Here, mukhang read and write lang, never man understand. That's good enough educational qualification, right? So we have a uber egalitarian basic qualification, and yet once you run, suddenly it doesn't seem as egalitarian. Suddenly, yung pala, kailangan mo ng some basic machinery. Isn't that some inherent tension there in the qualification for someone who wants to be president? Dito nga, kung gusto mag-janitor yata ng sales lady, you have to have college degrees na, but not for a president. But apparently, you have to have machinery. So someone not very educated but with money apparently is qualified enough to be a president. I'm just pushing it to its logical limit because for me, it doesn't make sense. I'm sorry. It's just, okay, it might make sense, but there's a tension there. I think that has to be discussed. Yeah.
Yes, mahirap paniwalaan na magkakaroon ng instance na isang tao who's not unable to read and write will have the wherewithal to mount a campaign to run for higher office, 'di ba? Like a president or vice president. So parang may inconsistency nga doon. Pero on the one hand, hindi rin naman imposible na somebody who's just able to read and write ay makagarner ng suporta ng isang political party.
Right.
So but yun nga, very unlikely.
Tapos meron daw moves na parang dedemanda or kakasuhan yung mga nuisance candidates. So, meron ba sa batas na gano'n? Oh. To penalize them?
Pwede
ganon?
lang pwede lang i-cancel or i-declare silang nuisance candidate and therefore hindi maka-count yung kanilang candidacy. Unless however merong misrepresentation or falsification of some sort doon sa kanilang doon sila pwedeng kasuhan.
Alam mo Richard, ang idea ko diyan para mabawasan yung mga nuisance candidate, humingi sila ng bond. 1 milyon.
Actually, pero diba? Yun nga, it goes against the spirit of the Constitution, which is very egalitarian, right? Just read and write, pwede ka na tumakbong president. Tapos ngayon, biglang para may bail money ka na. You know what I'm saying? Para may escrow. You know what I'm saying? Parang, I don't know, I'm just, yun nga point ko is, parang there's, I won't say hypocrisy, but there's some contradiction there that I'm trying to make sense out of if I can. So yun yung issue ng nuisance, no?
Ang tanong ko Richard, example, ito, isang maganda example din sa nangyari ngayon. Si Calyodi, can he be considered a nuisance candidate or ano?
He has networks of support across the mga labor groups and all.
That's what you have to show.
Yes. Hindi lang pera. Yung meron kang network of support, meron siyang chapters all across the country.
Okay.
Malaking basis ni Calyodi, wag natin i-understand.
Kasi I'm not in terms lang of what can be considered nuisance or hindi. Kasi meron kang political machinery kahit papaano. Kailangan you have to prove that.
Minimum. Meron kang minimum nationwide.
Bare
minimum. And then from there you can, although of course walang quantitative formula or something.
Yun
Kailan ba natin malaman sino mga final hindi nuisance? I mean, is there kind of a flexibility on the date na hindi na pwede lahat mga to or yun nga, like is there a deadline also for when ma-determine sinong nuisance at sinong hindi?
Yung petition for declaration of a candidate as a nuisance candidate must be filed at the latest 5 days from the last day of filing the certificate of candidacy.
So that's October pa? Hindi November? Yes. After substitution to or after October? So that should be October
after the initial filing, oo. So kung meron man may mga instances of nuisance candidates, dapat na i-file na yan.
So tapos na.
At that time. So dapat na i-file na, oo.
Pero what about yung mga nag-substitution bigla for presidency now? So 5 days later again, pwede to go against them?
Kung nuisance candidates sila, pwede. 5 days later,
last Monday, di ba? Nag-replace. So pwede, we have 5 more days to say. So that means malaki ang natin, field natin ngayon. Kasama na sila Parlade, sila, ang dami, di ba?
Yun nga Like isa pang tanong dyan, yung independent si Abelia.
So, yun pa, yeah.
Diba? Ano ang basihan to call him a nuisance candidate or to include him doon sa mga finalists ng ano?
I think the COMELEC will give a presumption na hindi ka nuisance candidate unless it can be shown by the petitioner na nuisance candidate talaga. So ang burden is on the part of the person assailing the candidacy of the candidate.
Attorney Star is not here to argue for or against any person and potential client. I mean, can you give us an idea what are the petitions now being filed against the leading candidate so far, which is Bongbong Marcos Jr.? What is the argument of both sides? What should we watch out for? For political junkies, parang ano yung mga dates, ano yung mga potential decisions ang dapat namin titignan, ano yung mga legal coordinates ng dapat malaman ng tao in order to, I would say, have a following of this issue in an informed way. No, hindi lang yung marites, yung alam namin which is which.
As far as I know, there are currently 2 petitions pending regarding the candidacy of ex-Senator Bongbong Marcos. And the first, like I mentioned, was a petition for disqualification. And the second was a petition for cancellation of the COC. Yung ground or yung factual grounds na ginamit sa parehong petition, I believe are the same. It's the non-filing of income tax returns of
Moral
ITRs for
turpitude?
certain years. Yes. Well, dalawa actually, dahil yung crime for which he was supposedly convicted carried a penalty of imprisonment of more than 18 months.
Right.
Kaya nga lang,
Years,
ang
I think,
nangyari,
no? 3 years.
although na-convict siya sa trial court at na-affirm yung conviction sa Court of Appeals, yung Court of Appeals tinanggal yung penalty of imprisonment. Marami, of course.
I mean, is there any explanation why they did that? Like, yeah, guilty ka pa rin, pero hindi ka namin i-punish masyado. You just pay something.
Well, maraming mga legal luminaries nagsasabi na hindi dapat ginawa yan ng Court of Appeals. Siyempre, ang mga abogado ni Mr. Marcos are saying that, of course, the Court of Appeals can do that. It is within the discretion of the Court of Appeals. But that is what happened. Ang nangyari kasi, naging final yung judgment na yon dahil hindi na ito na-question ng either party. So, whether right or wrong, it has become final. And so as things stand, walang penalty of imprisonment yung crime that he was convicted of.
Right.
So the other possible ground for disqualification, kung wala na yung imprisonment of more than 18 months, is having been convicted of a crime involving moral turpitude. So like we said,
attorney, sa ating mga moral
yung
followers.
moral turpitude.
Mga decente namin na followers. Ano itong moral?
Actually, the term moral turpitude has escaped a clear definition. It's a concept that we imported from the US.
Right.
So wala kang makikitang definition ng moral turpitude in any law that uses the phrase. So ordinarily, di ba, the law would define the phrases used in its language, but itong moral turpitude wala siyang set legal definition. So what we do is we look at jurisprudence, so yung mga previous cases na decide ng mga courts. So like we said, it is a concept that was imported from the United States. It was first used, I believe, in the Immigration Act of 1915. At sinasabi dun sa Immigration Act na yung mga immigrants who have been convicted of a crime involving moral turpitude can be deported. And so in 1951, a case was brought before the US Supreme Court, the case of Jordan versus George, involving an Italian immigrant na pinapa-deport ng gobyerno.
Bakit?
And guess what the crime was? Supposedly of that Italian immigrant, he was convicted of tax evasion.
Oh.
So sabi ng
Italian connection. Yeah.
Yes, oo. And so sabi ng immigration ay pwede siyang ma-deport under the Immigration Act because tax evasion or conspiracy to defraud the US government of taxes is a crime involving moral turpitude. And the US Supreme Court in that case agreed that indeed the crime of tax evasion includes the element of fraud, and therefore it involves moral turpitude. So that was a Supreme Court decision in the United States. So hindi naman tayo necessarily bound ng decisions, of course, ng Korte Suprema ng United States unless our own Supreme Court will adopt the same definition. And as far as the Philippine Supreme Court is concerned, there have been several cases dealing with moral turpitude. Isa sa mga pinakasikat na kaso is actually an old case, yung pinakaunang kaso, in Rebasa. It's a 1920 case. Actually, it involves the disbarment of a lawyer. And one of the grounds kasi for the disbarment of a lawyer at that time is conviction of a crime involving moral turpitude. And that particular lawyer was convicted of the crime of abduction with consent. And so he was being disbarred on that ground. So the question was, is abduction with consent a crime involving moral turpitude? At dahil wala ngang definition sa batas, ang ginamit ng Supreme Court natin ay yung definition sa isang legal dictionary, yung Bovier's Law Dictionary. At sinasabi dun sa Law Dictionary na yon, ang moral turpitude is any act that is contrary to justice, honesty, modesty, and good morals. And using that,
wala na yata
napaka-broad, napaka-vague. So
That's
sabi
not
ng Korte
helpful.
Suprema,
Pero they keep
Kailan,
on using
nagtanan
that word,
sila.
no?
Sorry, Mark. Na-scandal ako, abduction with consent. Yun, nagtanan sila.
something like that. Oo. Apparently,
Ganun pala. May
minor
kaso palang
siguro
ganun.
ito.
Patay
Oo,
tayo
apparently
dyan.
minor siguro ito. Tapos,
Naku po,
tapos
naku po.
abduction with consent yung kaso. And the Supreme Court said that abduction is consent is a crime involving moral turpitude. So titignan din natin yung mga subsequent cases, and I think there were 2 cases. Actually, nagkaroon ng enumeration, and I would like to read the enumeration in one of the cases that was decided by the Supreme Court.
Ayan, basa. Basa.
In the case of IRRR versus NLRC 1993, ang haba nito. So, nag-enumerate lang yung court kasi hindi siya makapagbigay ng definition. Sabi ng Supreme Court, ito yung mga example ng crimes na involving moral turpitude. So, abduction with consent, bigamy, concubinage, smuggling, rape, estafa, attempted bribery, profiteering, robbery, murder, theft, illicit sexual relations, violation of bouncing checks, falsification, intriguing against honor, violation of anti-fencing, perjury, forgery, direct bribery, at frustrated homicide. So mahaba.
Marami
In
pala
another-
kaming pwede disqualify.
Actually, madami.
Kaming pwede ma-disqualify.
Ito, another interesting enumeration, yung kaso naman ng Zari versus Flores. Ang kaso na involved naman dito is libel. So the Supreme Court again said na maaaring makonsider na crime involving moral turpitude yung libel. At again, the Supreme Court in that case made an enumeration. At this time kasama na sa enumeration yung tax evasion or evasion of income tax. So in yet another case, itong Paras versus Bailoses, sinabi na lang na Supreme Court. So yung mga enumeration naman na to, hindi siya exhaustive, meaning hindi lamang ito yung mga crimes involving moral turpitude. So sinabi na lang ng Supreme Court doon sa Paras versus Bailoses na basta kasama sa mga element yung fraud, sa mga elements ng crime yung fraud or panloloko, it will be considered moral turpitude. So yun ang magiging, I think that is what these disqualification or cancellation cases will turn on. It's whether the crime of not filing income tax returns for certain years will constitute moral turpitude.
Balik ko lang, saan case yung merong kasamang tax evasion? Anong example na case yun? Tandaan mo to, Richard, kasi baka ito yung mukhang ito yung posibleng
Zari versus Flores, Mark. It's a 1979 case.
Philippines.
Zari. Oo, Philippine case.
Hindi Italian to. Okay.
Hindi.
Wait lang, attorney. I just have just devil's advocate. Kung ako parang from Mars, no? Punta din parang wait lang. Etong tao na pinapa-disqualify, nag-congressman, nag-senador, tumakbong vice-presidente, na Supreme Court pa yung talo niya. No one raised this issue. Then suddenly now that he's running for president, gusto siya people are questioning whether he has the qualification to run for the higher office. I mean, isn't that a little bit hypocritical or opportunistic or inconsistent? I mean, hinayaan na siya tumakbo for all those positions. He was a senator of the Republic, no? In this case, in the case of Bongbong Marcos Jr., isn't this unfair? Or I would even say that in the case in 2016, Grace Poe was a senator. She was allowed to run for all those positions, and it was only when she ran for the presidency na biglang parang yun siya. So yun lang, I'm just trying to play the devil's advocate here. Could you tell us from a legal standpoint, how does that make sense?
Definitely, I can imagine that the lawyer for Mr. Marcos will raise that,
right.
That this appears to be an afterthought, and it is only being raised now because he's running for the highest office in the land.
Right.
Meron tayong konsepto na tinatawag na estopel. So stop na yung mga tao from questioning his qualification dahil nakailang posisyon na nga naman siya, nakailang national position na siya, and still at this time nobody questioned. So I would like to add lang, Richard and Mark, na it's also interesting in these cases decided by the Supreme Court na yung isang crime like homicide or frustrated homicide, it can be considered as a crime involving moral turpitude or not, depending on the facts. So
So homicide pero hindi ka turpitude. Parang ay labo na pare. So ano ka, pwede kang mamatay tao.
Ano yung
pero
homicide
moral ka.
na doesn't hit on the moral turpitude?
Yes, oo. Meron kasing isang kaso na sinabi ng Supreme Court na hindi siya, kahit na homicide siya, it doesn't involve moral turpitude dahil napatay lang daw naman niya yung biktima out of self-defense. So,
Okay. So,
wala daw
That's
moral
understandable,
depravity.
self-defense.
Oo, wala daw moral depravity in that case. Pero tatanungin mo kasi actually kung if it was done in self-defense, dapat hindi siya na-convict of homicide dahil
Exactly,
it's an extenuating circumstance. Self-defense, it's an exempting circumstance. So nakakapagtaka na convict siya, ibig sabihin hindi naniwala yung trial court na may self-defense. Pero at the same time, the court look into those circumstances. Siguro hindi lang maganda yung pagkakapruweba ng element of self-defense sa trial court. But the Supreme Court regarded it as a circumstance showing na wala namang moral depravity itong taong to. Whereas, kung yung homicide was intentional, I would imagine that the Supreme Court will say na ito involves moral depravity and therefore
yung attorney, yung homicide through reckless imprudence. Diba? Yung aksidente.
So walang moral depravity. Pwedeng makalusot yung mga through negligence kasi walang intent.
Intentional maliciousness, parang ganun yung moral depravity. Talagang malisyoso kang tao, loko-loko ka, may gusto kang lolokohin.
Kung nag-fraud ka, you intended to
malisyoso
commit the fraud.
Yon. Okay. Now it's clear to us what's going on here.
So titignan natin kung merong ill intent or malicious intent or moral depravity or element of fraud doon sa kaso ng hindi pagka-file ng income tax return. So it's on a case-to-case basis and we don't want to preempt the COMELEC and the Supreme Court in making the decision.
Factors na titignan dito.
Yes.
Who decides dito sa cancellation and disqualification cases?
Parehong COMELEC yan, Mark.
Parehong COMELEC.
It was filed with the COMELEC. Pagkatapos magdesisyon ng COMELEC, pwede pang mag-motion for reconsideration. It will be decided by the COMELEC en banc. And then, pag decide ng COMELEC en banc, pwede pa itong i-apela sa Supreme Court. So, maaring dumating pa itong kasong to sa Supreme Court.
So, yun yung process.
At maaring tatagal ito until next year, well into next year, right? If that's the case.
Pwedeng mangyari yan. Ordinarily, dapat matapos yung kaso bago ma-print yung ballot para magkaroon na ng kasiguruhan kung masasama ba yung pangalan nung kandidato na yun sa balota. But like in the case of in the disqualification case that I handled, na-print na yung balota, hindi pa na-desisyonan yung kaso. So, it should be given priority, pero sometimes hindi talaga umaabot.
Kailan ba yung balota i-print? Sorry, Mark, I just need to know the date. Kailan ba yung print ng balota dapat?
COMELEC ang nag-set niyan eh. Oo, COMELEC ang nag-set. So, hindi natin alam kung anong date yung sinet ng COMELEC. Oo.
Sige,
but,
ikaw na lang, Mark. Sorry.
Lumalampas yan usually.
So, yung unang, di ba yung unang magde-decide yung sa COMELEC, yung mga commissioners ng COMELEC ang unang magde-decide.
Yes, yung division.
Yung division kung saan final.
Nilaraffle yan sa dalawang division eh. Kasi ang COMELEC natin are composed of 6 commissioners and 1 chairman. So 7 sila. So per division, tatlo-tatlo yan. Ang nagde-decide muna is yung division. So pag-file ng petition, nilaraffle to either of the 2 divisions. Oo. So yun muna magde-decide yung division of 3. At pag nagkaroon na ng decision, kung sino man yung natalo doon sa decision, by majority vote. Yes, by
so
majority
dalawa lang
vote.
out of 3. That's
yes.
That's So after nun, yung COMELEC en banc, ilan na silang nagde-decide nun?
Lahat na. 7 na sila yon.
Ito na. So majority pa rin.
Yes.
So 4 dapat mag-yes pa rin. Oh wow, this is crazy. Woo! Marami pa pwede mangyari. Marami pa pwede mangyari, Mark. Yun lang masasabi ko.
Kaya nga. Para alam lang natin yung mga possible.
Either way, man.
Kasi alam niyo nababasa ko sa Facebook ngayon. magkaka-people power daw kung sakaling magkaroon ng
Marcos
mga
people power.
cancellation na yan.
Wala Marcos ang people power.
Yun ang nababasa ko, di ba? Pero syempre, ang tanong din niya, yung military ba, yung ano ba, syempre, ang military, alam naman natin.
Ilocano marami din doon sa military.
Okay sila diba? Pero ang dami factors. So after nun, Supreme Court na. So tatlong
Supreme
step.
Court. Yes, oo.
Tatlong stages.
Pwede pa rin i-appeal yung Supreme Court?
Wala
na. That's it. Final.
Wala na. The Supreme Court is the court of last resort. Although pag nagdesisyon yung Supreme Court, technically, pwede ka pang mag-file ng motion for reconsideration. Pero bihira naman yung binabaliktad ng Supreme Court yung sarili niya.
Yung lower court ng higher court. Well, just to ask you on this, kasi sorry, sabi ni James Jimenez, final conviction for a crime that involves moral turpitude is a ground for disqualification kahit walang kulong. And then
yes,
sinabi
that's
niya,
true.
Yeah, I showed that not all convicts are prohibited, only those who have been sentenced to 18 months or more, or those convicted for crimes involving moral turpitude. Can you explain that again? I know you explained that 18 months rule, etc. How can we make sense out of yung sinabi niya?
So, dalawa yung those are two separate grounds for disqualification. So, yung that you were convicted of a crime kahit na hindi involving moral turpitude. Halimbawa, illegal recruitment or negligence.
Negligence.
Sabihin na lang natin, mas malinaw na hindi yon involving moral turpitude dahil hindi siya intentional. Tapos ang penalty is more than 18 months. I-assume natin na more than 18 months. Disqualify pa rin siya.
Kahit hindi ka nakulong.
Kahit na hindi siya involving hindi, kailangan sentence yung sentence to imprisonment yung tao.
Pero sabi
so
nito,
although his crime
how is it possible?
Kahit walang kulong kung involving moral turpitude, that's a separate ground. Or siya. So either you get convicted of a crime kahit na hindi moral turpitude basta 18 months and above yung imprisonment, or kahit na walang imprisonment basta involving moral turpitude. Those are two separate grounds.
So yung si Bongbong lusot na dun sa 18 months kasi walang kulong yung conviction niya Ang tanong
It
na lang
appears,
dyan,
although
moral turpitude,
if I may mention, Mark,
yung tax issue, di ba?
may binanggit si attorney na it appears kasi yes, attorney.
It appears na kahit na hindi siya nakulong or walang sentence yung conviction niya, it appears, at least from the copy of the petition that I read, ito yung petition for cancellation of COC ni Attorney Tedte, kini-question pa rin yung pagkakatanggal ng sentence of imprisonment. So sinasabi pa rin doon sa petisyon na dapat hindi counted yung pagtanggal ng sentence na yon dahil that was illegal or that was invalid. Right. But I think ang mas klaro na ground na pinupush nila ay yung the crime involves moral turpitude.
Yeah, regardless of whether you served or not sentenced.
Yes.
Can they question that as a Court of Appeals galing?
Of course, again, it's up for the court to decide, but initial impression ko lang kasi naging final na yung judgment ng Court of Appeals and nobody questioned it. Parang mahirap. Hindi ko sinasabing hindi na pwede. Dahil we can tell what the court will eventually say. Mahirap lang dahil matagal nang naging final yung judgment na yun Ordinarily, sa isang kaso, kapag if you find something questionable.
1997 pa to
Yes, that should have been questioned, pero hindi yun nangyari. So, parang mahirap lang, but not impossible.
Yun lang. Okay. That's very, thank you very much, attorney, for that. Kasi we just wanted to understand anong weight ng arguments na yan potentially, no? At ano yung mga, yun nga. So, good that na-clarify natin. So, moral turpitude, even though you haven't served, kulong, etc., you can still be disqualified. Or for a non-moral turpitude na more than 18 months or above, di ba? Ang kulong.
Yung sentence.
So that could cover, for instance, yung sinasabi mong self-defense homicide, which is not a moral turpitude case. But the person under some weird argument na, okay, we don't buy your self-defense argument for you to go scot-free, but we buy it for you to run for the president, just in case.
Right.
I'm just trying to show that this is weird, right? It's like, consuelo mo na lang. Pwede ka pa rin mag-presidente, okay lang yan. Pero ano, it's weird, but okay, I see what's happening. So thank you for clarifying that. Mark, do we have other questions? Before siguro we can ask more general questions. Ano yung mga, as someone who does public legal literacy education, what do you think ang kailangan malaman ng ating mga voters, ang ating mga audience to have a much more informed legal understanding of yung mga nangyari? At what are the things to watch out for, siguro, in that sense, based on sa mga gulo na nakita nyo in the past, based on your own experiences?
Well, nakikita ko dito, every election na lang nagiging issue yung substitution, nagiging issue din yung qualifications. So perhaps efforts should be exerted to clarify the provisions, the legal provisions on nuisance candidates, substitutions, and the qualifications of the candidates, especially for those offices, president and vice president. As far as the public is concerned, since there are these legal issues that are being raised, kung minsan we lose sight of the more important ones, which would be the platform of the various candidates. So at this point, umaasa ka na sana pinag-uusapan na yung platform. But hindi pa natin nakikita yan. Do we wait for the debates to happen para pag-usapan yung platform ng mga candidates? Parang ngayon, it's just parang fan club ang nangyayari. We're pro Bongbong kami, or pro Lenny kami, or pro Isko kami, or pro whatever. Pero hindi pa sa akin hindi malinaw kung naiintindihan ba ng mga followers kung bakit nila sinusuportahan ng isang kandidato, on what basis, or is there following based on the advocacies, based on the plans, the programs of that particular candidate. So far, hindi pa yun malinaw.
Parang cult of personality.
If at all, mga motherhood statements lang. Oo.
But perhaps that's what the politicians want, right? A lot of them, they don't want to go into the details. Kasi, I mean, I'm just saying, once you go to the details of policy, that's where you're going to lose some of your donors potentially, right? I mean, let's just go and excite stocks.
And yung mga ibang voters din, siguro naboboringan sila.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just saying, like, the risk is not worth it for a lot of politicians. Parang, the moment na maging detalyado ako, mawala yung gana ng tao. Tapos yung ibang donors ko, uy, wait lang, baka matamaan ang business ko dyan. Di na kita bigyan pera. You know what I'm saying? Because the devil is in the details. Once you bring out the devil, you might lose actually a lot of supporters and all. So people prefer to, as much as possible, all I'm saying is, kung tayo ay hindi mag-pressure sa ating mga politiko, right? Talagang mananitili lang yung debate sa level of motherhood statements. Of course, there are exceptions. There are certain candidates who try to specify this more. But the reality is that the politicians' interest is to keep it at the level of personalistic politics, right? Because there, pwede nila idaan sa impression management, sa performativity, sa drama. Hindi na kailangan pag-usapan yung competence, policy, familiarity, etc., etc. Now, which for me, of course, is contrary to the spirit of democracy, because the democracy is about responsible, mature choices to be made by empowered citizens. Yun yung end goal natin. It's not just making choices for the sake of it, but making informed choices in a mature democracy. And that should be the long-term goal of the Philippines. Wala pa tayo dyan. Let's just be realistic about it. We're not Sweden, we're not Norway yet, right? But our hope is that we move in that direction. Pero ang frustration ko kasi dito is, it seems the rules are so loose in terms of their definition, in terms of their application, that there's so much room for mumbo-jumbo, telenovela, and cheap drama, which unfortunately is making I and Mark too busy about that. I mean, if I'm gonna go to the details of this, people are gonna ask me, anong tingin mo dun sa sinabing cocaine ni Tatay Digong about this kind of, like,
right.
The problem. I mean, it's gonna be hard for people like us, policy people, to bring it to the policy when there's much more quote unquote exciting stuff to talk about, right? So parang pinapahirapan pa kami na gusto talaga mag-angat, ng antas ng public discourse, at yun ang frustration namin. So going back to the issue, do you think we can do something with the law? Maybe Congress can pass certain laws. I heard there was yung isang siguro sinasabi nila na parang to avoid nuisance candidate, there should be some price to pay if you file certificate for candidacy. Parang temporarily you can be suspended from office or something. I don't know. Like, there's some suggestions percolating out there in the Congress about avoiding yung mockery of the process, this whole substitution mumbo jumbo, this monkey business that has been played over the. Kasi sabi ni James Jimenez, dati uso yan sa mga lower level, sa mga yung mga pero ngayon it has been brought up nag-bottom up to from the whole Davao politics of President Duterte next level. Is there something that we can do from a legal standpoint to deal with this issue?
Well, perhaps stiffer penalties can be imposed for people filing nuisance candidacies. Pero isang aspeto lang yun, Richard. Yung sinasabi mo na what also prevents candidates from being very specific about their platforms, yung issue ng mga funders. One of the things that can be improved on as well is yung implementation of the provisions on transparency as far as the financial supporters of the candidates are concerned.
Yeah.
So para matitimbang ng mga tao na kaya ba ganito yung plataforma ng kandidato na to dahil funder niya si ganito. So parang hindi rin. Yes, they're quite strict, although makikita mo rin na yung mga candidates are supported by big business interests. So I think it's inevitable that there will be big business interests supporting candidates because sila may mga pera para makatulong sa kampanya.
Sana
so kailangan lang
yung mga pro-mining lang mga oligarchs.
Pero yung problema natin, Richard, sa election reform, just like many of our other problem, it also comes down to babalik tayo doon sa problema natin sa judicial reform Kasi kahit maganda yung electoral reform mo, kung wala ding napaparusahan, wala ding nahuhuli sa vote buying, wala nako-convict sa vote buying, walang sa illegal campaign contributions.
Mark, di ba may maganda kang proposal sa vote buying? I really like that. Kasi si Mike Enriquez sinatanong ko isang araw. Gusto kita i-cite. Di ba sabi, yung parang diniscuss natin is maraming tao, kasi attorney, I looked at studies. This is in light of what Robredo Lenny said, na parang kunin mo yung pera, pero wag mong botohin. But actually, if you look at social science research, it shows that a lot of people who get the money, they actually parang meron pala pre de honor, even after vote buying. And there are many reasons for that, including the fact that baka kung mahuli kayo, yung barangay nyo mismo ang pwede ma-punish. Or through Facebook and through your peers, politicians actually check if medyo alanganin ka, yung binayaran sa'yo, ay baka hindi ka boboto. So when I saw the social science literature, medyo nag-iba ako ng isip na yung siguro sinasabi ni Lenny is hindi practicable. Na kunin mo yung pera, pero wag mo botohin. So Mark had a very ingenious idea. He said, why not, pag kunin mo pera, kuha ka na ebidensya, ibigay mo sa kalaban, ipapa-disqualify mo doon sa kalaban. Let the kalaban take the risk. Kasi madali para sa atin sa Manila pag-usapan yan. But if you're in certain parts of the country, my God, warlords in charge, you don't want to, you don't want to go to the Comelec and say, hey, this guy. The next day, baka wala na yung buong area, di ba? So, I mean, let's just be brutal. So, sabi ni Mark, baka in some areas, sabi mo na sa kalaban yun ang gamitin. Sila na lang mag-away, di ba?
O kaya tasan niya. Just kidding.
Beating wars,
di ba?
That's yung konsepto na sinasabi ni Mark na basically hindi niya tinanggap talaga yung pera, ginamit lang niyang ebidensya para ibigay niya doon sa
ibigay siya from behind the scenes ng prize money. Consultant.
Ganun din. Anyway, kasi vote buying and both vote selling, meaning yung tumanggap ng pera, they're both liable for an election offense. So parehong crime yun. So kung tinanggap mo yung pera with the intention of receiving it for your vote, it's also an election offense, and the penalty for an election offense is 1 to 6 years imprisonment. And you can be deprived of your right to suffrage. Pwedeng ma-disqualify ka na from ever voting. Kapag ikaw ay na-convict of vote buying or vote selling, pwede ka ring ma-disqualify from running for office. But magandang basahin to sa batas, pero kamusta naman yung implementation? Kasi napakatalamak ng vote buying at vote selling. Wala pa. Actually, that's what I was about to say. I don't know of any actual case whereby vote seller or vote buyer, wala pa akong nababalitaan na kaso na ganyan. Vote buying and vote selling. But it's an election offense.
Yun nga, Richard, pero that still comes down doon sa problema natin sa judicial reform. Kasi syempre ako, kung...
And capacity building. Ay kung wala kang kakayan, ay walang budget tong COMELEC. Di ba? Ang liit ng budget nila. Parati sinasabi ni James yan, para pinaliit pa ba? Ang liit ng budget nila. How are you gonna monitor so many candidates?
No. I mean kasi kunyari kung ikaw kung gusto mong isumbong si ganitong mayor na vote buying, ang pwedeng di ba, pag nasa probinsya ka, pwedeng maraming masamang gawin sa si mayor.
Exactly,
Kung hindi matibay yung judicial system
yung police
natin,
yung police protection,
yung police sa kanya, yung mga ano sa kanya or whatever, di ba?
But I'm saying even the COMELEC should be empowered to. Kasi minsan, baka yung COMELEC official din, takot din siya, di ba? Yung dun sa probinsya, ganun, di ba? Ayaw niyang harapin yung warlord, di ba? Kahit may ebidensya siya. You know what I'm saying? Like, that's the thing. You have to empower not only our judicial institutions, make sure our police talagang pinoprotektahan ng tao, but yung COMELEC din dapat, di ba? They have to have sufficient budget. They already got the mandate, but it's one thing to have the mandate on paper. It's another thing to have the resources to back that up. But attorney, I remember this interview I did with James Jimenez, and the issue of election interference came into the picture, right? Because we have that a lot in the US, China, Russia, Europe, a lot of that Russia, diba? Other countries, North Korea, etc., are getting involved. Tapos tinanong ko, Manchurian candidate tayo ng Manchurian candidate dito ng kung ano-anong mga sinusulat ng tao dyan. Yung pala, wala yata tayong batas on foreign interference or foreign financing monitoring or anything like that. Diba? Kasi I know in the US and other countries, in Australia, for instance, they have very strict new laws that they pass para siguraduhin foreign agents are not funding certain candidates, essentially Manchurian candidates, etc. Parang we don't have any, forget about the implementation part, we don't even have a legal architecture, it seems, to deal with that. And for me, that's kind of like a recklessly responsible, isn't it? I mean, it doesn't take a genius to realize our system is a little bit open to manipulation by foreign powers. You can choose which one you don't like, right? But for me, it's just not encouraging to know that ang dali pala mag-manipulate ng foreign powers ang elections sa Pilipinas if they can just pour money into our country and there's no surveillance of that. There's no monitoring. Sorry, I don't want to use the surveillance. There is no monitoring of that process.
Well, I'm not too sure if James Jimenez was merely pertaining to the aspect of monitoring, but sa ilalim ng batas natin, it's very clear that a foreign government cannot financially support a candidate or cannot fund a candidate.
But do we have a committee or specific bodies to monitor and deal with that? Yeah, I know it's like anti-dynasty law. No? It's like there's no enabling law. Is there an enabling law? Is there a specific agency set up to deal with this?
COMELEC. It has to be COMELEC.
Pa rin yan.
It's the general provision is in the Constitution, but there is a provision in the Omnibus Election Code, Section 96, that a foreign national or entity or even government cannot financially support a candidate.
So meron pala.
And meron ding provisions whereby Section 96 of the Omnibus Election Code. Yun na nga lang yung siguro ang sinasabi ni James, there is no system
I think
in existence for the monitoring.
There's no enabling
for the monitoring
law to create some sort of a specific agencies na may IRR. You know what I'm saying? Kasi yun ang napansin ko when I work in the government and all that. Batas is something generic. What you also need is implementing rules and regulations, right? And you have a body, my budget. That's really where the real thing happens, right? Madali magpasa ng motherhood statement law, whatever.
Pero alam mo, Richard, I would argue it should be COMELEC because COMELEC has the plenary mandate of under the Constitution and under the Omnibus Election Code to implement all election laws. So that's all encompassing. Lahat ng mga batas natin na may kinalaman sa eleksyon, pati itong provision that I just mentioned, yung Section 96 of the Omnibus Election Code and Article 19 of the Constitution. It is the COMELEC's responsibility. Now, I can imagine that COMELEC is not given enough funding to perform all its multifarious functions.
Sorry for cutting you there, because it's also a question of you need state-of-the-art intelligence gathering and all of that. I'm not sure COMELEC you have to work with NBI, you have to work with NICA, you know what I'm saying? Kasi serious stuff.
So the infrastructure is not there for them to implement those provisions.
You need James
I would agree. But at least there's that provision. But perhaps COMELEC should find a way to implement that particular, to give teeth to that particular.
Tsaka may tanong din ako. If you commit if you commit, parang kung dayain mo yung, di ba they are required to submit yung mga total na nagastos, yung mga,
Right.
kung dayain mo
Yes.
yun, ano ba yung penalty? Di ba ang penalty lang, disqualification lang? Wala din yatang kulong or paano
It's
ba ang
actually an
penalty?
election offense din, Mark. It's one of the many enumerated election offenses under the Omnibus Election Code. So all election offenses merong pagkakakulong yan, pwedeng makulong.
Okay.
But it's all in the implementation. If it is not implemented very strictly, hindi nabubusi sa lahat ng whether accurate ba yung mga declarations as far as funders or
wala pa ako
financial
narinig
supporters.
na check or there's this one time lang naalala ko na meron silang sinampahan ng kaso ng ganyan, yung si ER Ejercito kasi yung TV commercial niya sumobra. Parang obvious na obvious yung TV commercial ang haba. Nalagpas doon sa budget ng required. Pero yung parang actual na gastos na parang hirap nang i-monitor din. And wala pa ako narinig na meron silang sinubukang imbestigahan na ito. We all know na billions ang nagagastos kapag sa elections, pero yun is there a way kaya para parang wala
Is there a law we can tweak or upgrade or update? I'm sure the law is perfect, right? I'm sure there's some stuff we can do. Kasi yun nga yung debate. You can always say, well, the problem is implementation, but you can also argue that if the source of the problem is also legally not updated, it makes the implementation update also harder. You know what I'm saying? Because someone is like parang cat and mouse yun eh. Diba? If you actually the law, it makes the implementation probably easier at some points. Yeah.
Exactly. Perhaps yun ang pwedeng gawin din ng COMELEC. You mentioned kanina yung pagkakaroon ng mga implementing rules and regulations.
Right. The
COMELEC actually has authority to issue implementing rules and regulations on matters pertaining to elections. So if the issue of funding and support from foreign entities is something that we think are important, dapat siguro magkaroon din ng set of rules and regulations ang COMELEC to check, first to check and then to monitor and to implement the prohibition under the law. I believe that there are provisions under the Omnibus Election Code kung saan pwedeng ang hingin pa ng COMELEC ang tulong ng Commission on Audit just to verify or to confirm the veracity of the declarations ng mga candidates as far as funding is concerned. So maybe this is something that they can do in coordination with the Commission on Audit if they won't have enough manpower to accomplish it.
Mark, you have a question on that, on other election-related monitoring and stuff?
Yeah, okay na.
Another question, Attorney Star, before we go towards the end of this conversation. I think magto 2 hours na tayo, no? What about the issue of independence? Of course, we know legally speaking, the COMELEC is independent, but how does the appointment happen? And how do we make sure the appointments do not create any kind of political allegiances or vulnerability to executive or pressure from other elected officials?
Well, that's difficult because the reality is the commissioners of COMELEC are all appointed by the president.
Right.
So, in fact, under the present COMELEC, si Commissioner Rowena Guanzon lang ang hindi appointee ni Pangulong Duterte. Well, Chairman Abbas was initially appointed, I think, by Pinoy, but he was appointed as chairman by the president. Right. So technically, na-promote siya to chairman by the president. And the rest are all appointees of President Duterte. So that can be a source of apprehension on the part of a candidate na who's not allied with the president. Baka pag nagsampa siya ng kaso sa COMELEC, magiging adverse sa kanya yung decision. Of course, the COMELEC as a body should be independent, but we cannot discount the possibility that they are somehow influenced by, who appointed them.
Impune or something like that. It's just that parang gulo nung 2016, di ba? Yung on the case of Poe, parang, di ba parang yung daming disagreement sa loob within the COMELEC, lumalabas. I mean, I'm not sure that was sending the right signal, right? I mean, if the rules are clear and the understanding is clear, then it shouldn't have been as contentious as it was, and yet it ended up very contentious on the case of Senator Grace Poe last time, and it put
and the ruling of COMELEC was overturned by the Supreme Court. So iba
Exactly. I
yung
mean, that's
ruling
the
ng
point, like-
COMELEC, iba yung ruling ng Supreme Court.
So ang gulo in that sense.
But you know, the final arbiter is always the Supreme Court. So
Right.
whatever the decision or ruling of the COMELEC is, ultimately it will be reviewed by the Supreme Court.
Which brings
Richard,
the next issue, right?
tingin mo, do we need more commissioners sa COMELEC? Mas
I don't think-
madami. Kailangan, 7 is too small. Parang ang konti masyado. Parang baka pag mas madami, mas less,
Pwede rin. Pero nakikita ko naman na like nung nag-file ako ng petition for disqualification in the last elections, mabilis naman na na-dispose ng COMELEC yung kaso.
Right.
So it doesn't seem to me that they're that overloaded with cases.
I'm not sure the number is the issue here as much as the process by which people are appointed. Blah, blah, blah.
Right.
Which brings me to the Supreme Court, because all due respect, again, we're not trying to impugn or something like that. In the US, for instance, for you, I mean, we have covered, a lot of us have been watching very carefully the contentious process, but in the US, dadaan ka pa sa Senado, no? And it could be a very grueling process, no? Na porket inappoint ka lang ng isang presidente, hindi basta-basta you end up there. You have to go to the Senate. There's a lot of public scrutiny. There's a voting process. We saw that on Justice Kavanaugh's case, how contentious the process was, but how open the process was, how much scrutiny it was getting. And for many people, perhaps that was a good thing, although as dramatic and frustrating as it may have been for some people. But here, how is the appointments in the Supreme Court working? It doesn't seem to have the same level of public scrutiny and checks and balances that we see in the case of the United States. And some people are saying, well, what about our Supreme Court? To what degree is it going to be really independent when you have President Arroyo and President Duterte appointing 13 out of practically the super majority of justices are appointed by the president in this sense. No, it's not that pinili niya. Of course, may timing din. Kasi may retirement age yata sa atin, wala sa US, di ba? More voluntary yun. Can you tell us a little bit about that on the Supreme Court issue? Again, we're not trying to question the integrity of the institution, but I think we have to have an honest conversation about some of the concerns about ensuring that the integrity of the institution remains unquestionable or becomes unquestionable. And of course, sinasabi ko rin yan in light of yung nangyari kay Chief Justice Sereno, which was like, I think it was really a wrenching, traumatizing experience for a lot of people, for a lot of young law students, right? They're watching here, right, these titans of Philippine law shouting and fighting at each other. I mean, it was, I'm sorry, it was not really the most beautiful sight I've seen as far as Philippine democracy is concerned. But as a lawyer, what is your take on the situation with the Supreme Court, which is supposed to be the final arbiter, right, of justice in the country in one way or another?
I agree with you, Richard. The manner by which our Supreme Court justices are appointed, it's very crucial. Of course, it impacts on the administration of justice. And I recall here what Justice Scalia of the Supreme Court mentioned before, that in a democratic society, it's not really the Bill of Rights that's most important as far as guarding the freedoms of the citizens are concerned. It's the structure, it's the way by which the structure of the government is defined. So in this particular, in our system, unlike the US, na dumadaan sa Senado yung mga nominees for the Supreme Court before they get appointed by the President. So parang meron right away, merong check and balance doon sa proseso. So pag hindi pumasa sa Senado, hindi na ma-appoint ng Presidente. In our case, it doesn't pass through the legislature. It goes straight away to the President. But meron namang preliminary review. There's a Judicial and Bar Council na naglilista ng mga nominees that will be appointed by the President. So it's a Judicial and Bar Council that does the screening. So the proceedings of the JBC, as far as I know, are also public. In fact, the interviews are made publicly, even televised. So any citizen can voice out their objections to the appointment of a particular candidate. We just don't know how effective that is, but there is a mechanism. And it is only
nanonood niyan. I mean, I mean,
Well, yun na nga eh.
I've
Mga
watched
people are
more
interested
nominees
in,
of
lot
U.S.
more
Supreme
people,
Court
yes.
going through the process than Philippine. I'll just be honest. I don't know how many hours of Kavanaugh hearings I watched,
Mhm.
but you know, this is it. I was just like suddenly, oh, there's a news. We have a new Supreme Court justice. Next thing you know, appointed na yung former Chief Justice in another government agency
Mhm.
afterwards, right? I mean, like there's the
Right.
revolving
Mhm.
door aspect also here. I don't know what's going on
Mhm.
here, right? Yeah, I'm just trying to
Mhm.
thresh out the issues here.
Mhm. So these matters are matters of constitutional law. So these processes are
Mm.
governed by our constitution. So perhaps if there is an opportunity to revise the constitution in the future, these are things that we can fine tune to make sure na um, talagang merong check and balance sa mga mahalagang proseso ng gobyerno, including the appointment of our Supreme Court justices.
And attorney, yung ating jurisprudence and the whole, you know, the whole body of legal canons and everything we have. I mean, is this kind of a Spanish American hybrid system? I mean, how do we explain that? Because I know, for instance, in Japan, there's a Prussian influence. I mean, comparatively speaking, the Philippines legal you know, canons and jurisprudence
System, yes.
is more American
We're
or Spanish. I mean, how is this hybrid?
It's more hybrid. We're a civil law jurisdiction. We're not a common law jurisdiction,
Right,
meaning
right.
we have written laws. Hindi lang
Right.
to mga
Like
legal
Britain
principles.
now.
Yes, right. And since we were colonized by Spain, for instance, our civil code is mostly adopted from the
Spanish.
Spanish civil code, and then very little has changed since then. But we also adopt the system of precedents that's followed in the United States. A lot of the legal principles that we have were also imported from the US. So sometimes kapag merong mga novel legal issues na hinaharap ang Korte Suprema, persuasive yung interpretation ng US Supreme Court.
Right.
Especially if what is being interpreted is a law or provision that was imported from the United States. So merong value yung US jurisprudence as far as Philippine jurisprudence is concerned. So it's actually a mix, primarily civil law, but there are also traces of common law.
Right. Going back to the Spanish heritage, I mean, yung issue. I mean, you are also, I won't use the word feminist, but you're a woman leader, right? And you're concerned with issues like violence against women, and you know.
Why wouldn't you use feminist? I'm a feminist.
Okay, feminist. Maybe. Okay, I'm a feminist too. Okay. I don't know, just our culture. Anyways, so I mean, one of the things that is, I think, controversial, I remember back in the days, is yung crime of passion sa Philippines. So kunyari kung ikaw ay lalaki, nahuli mo yung asawa mong babae with someone else, you can like shoot and kill them, and that's fine. But otherwise, it doesn't work. I mean, isn't that kind of weird, archaic?
It is a lot. There are still so many archaic provisions in our penal code. That provision still exists. So
Yeah, that's
wala
weird,
pa
right?
rin crime of passion. We still have a very unequal or unfair provisions. For instance, big concubinage and adultery. Adultery is the one that's committed by the woman, and concubinage is committed by the man. And the penalty for both is different. For the two crimes is different. And mas mabigat yung penalty for adultery and napakagaan sa concubinage. Until recently, the crime of rape didn't bear the maximum penalty. So naging heinous crime lang siya after the law was amended. And there are still very much vestiges of this very, very
archaic,
archaic, yes, medieval provisions of law na hindi pa rin na re-revise up to now.
And on last note, maybe Mark, if you want, you can add also after that. I would be, you know, we welcome that. Lampas na tayo 2 hours yata. Of course, you're a lawyer, you're a concerned citizen, etc. But you're also, as I mentioned, you're a feminist, right? You believe in kind of mitigating, or in fact overcoming and transcending, hopefully, some of the patriarchal traditions that we inherited from the past. What are the gains we have made throughout the years and throughout the decades, and what are the things that you're most passionate about? I know that perhaps you're involved in you know, issues protecting victims of violence against women, etc. Based on your own record, based on your own advocacies and the clients you have handled, where is the Philippines going? Because if you look at the media headlines, the Philippines generally is doing fine, right? We're the most gender, I won't use the word gender equity wise, not equal, but gender equity wise, we tend to be #1 in Asia. And at some point, we're top 6, I think, just next to Scandinavian country. But now, bumaba tayo, I think 20 plus na lang tayo. But still, we do far better than almost all our neighbors, Japan, China, Korea, especially those countries, Indonesia, Malaysia, etc. So, some people could say, well, if Philippines is where women tend to do the best, right? I mean, we have had female presidents, women representation in media, in business sector is among the best in the world. But of course, it's all relative, right? So where do you think we got it right? And where do you think we should still make huge improvements, and how far we have gone in that direction?
Well, we've made major strides, Richard, and
Right.
especially as far as the judiciary is concerned. For instance,
Right.
there are more female judges now than ever.
Right.
It's probably nearly half of the judges
Right.
that we have right now are female. Pero sa Supreme Court, pagdating sa mataas na korte, mas outnumbered pa rin, heavily outnumbered pa rin ang mga babae. Mas marami pa rin male justices. So sa mga private law firms, for one, in the top positions among the mga partners, marami na rin mga babae. But still not equal. Mas marami pa rin sa mga top positions ang men versus women. But we're getting there. Dahil when I left law school, I think 60% of the students were already female. And I think that's the trend. Mas maraming gumagraduate from law school na babae ngayon. So there will come a time na mag-equalize din yan, and women will go to the top.
Diba? So it's just a matter of
yes.
time.
It's just a matter of
time.
time.
Lalaki lang nag-aabogado eh. So obviously it creates some distortions, no? But that distortion is being corrected now with more women getting business. Yeah.
Yes, but it's not enough to have more women in key positions. Kasi maraming mga instances na kahit babae yung prosecutor, kahit babae yung judge, or kahit babae yung handling lawyer, yung pananaw naman at paniniwala ng babae na judge or prosecutor ay medyo patriarchal pa rin, and medyo anti-women pa rin, or hindi pa rin protective of the interests of women. That's very common. There have been rape cases that I've handled before, female prosecutors in fact, na mas mahigpit pa yung standard ng female prosecutor compared to the male prosecutor. So sometimes it's not just
like
numbers.
that, I think. Yeah, I mean, we have this kind of women hating, I mean, misogynist women leaders, like they're women leaders who look down at women or something like that, or they try to outmen men in some questionable way, right?
Right. So kulang ng pagkamulat pa rin. Kulang ng pagkamulat. So I think that, marami ng efforts ngayon ang judiciary to conduct gender sensitivity like seminars for judges and prosecutors and public attorneys. Even in private companies, even in law firms, there are those gender sensitivity programs. And this is something that I actively participate in. So kailangan din mamulat yung mga players. I mean, both men and women actually to these issues. And it helps that legislation has also been catching up the past few years. May mga bagong legislation, yung anti-sexual harassment law, yung violence against women and children, yung bawal ang bastos law, yung that recent law that was enacted to address naman sexual harassment in the streets and not just in the workplace. So nagka-catch up then slowly ang batas, but hopefully pati yung mga different players sa ating judicial system mag-catch up din as far as their perspective is concerned, para maging equal ang treatment as far as men and women sa batas.
Thank you very much. Mark, do you have some final questions before we wrap up this very, very comprehensive and in-depth discussion? Mark, any? Pagod na.
Di naman.
Meron pa tayo episode, ha?
Ano ko lang, attorney. What are your thoughts on mga lawyers na nag-YouTube? Kasi, and yung iba nasa TikTok din.
You wanna do that yourself, right? Yeah.
Kasi ang dami ding nag-ano ngayon. What are your thoughts on
vlogger lawyer?
Mga lawyers na nag...
Well, I have no objection. It's part of freedom of expression, right, and freedom of speech if they want to use YouTube as a vehicle. But lawyers particularly have to be very careful because
Right.
bawal sa rules of legal ethics ang magbigay, for instance, ng legal advice to a particular client in a particular case.
Unfair
Nang
yun.
hindi mo naman on YouTube or on TV or wherever,
Radio,
na
kasi
hindi mo
dami din
naman,
ganun.
oo. Yes, kasi parang lumalabas na solicitation siya.
Yeah.
So baka naghahanap lang ng kliyente yung abogado at ginagamit yung YouTube para i-market yung
Kilala natin
services
mga
niya.
yan. Yeah.
Oo. So
Yeah.
there's a thin line maybe that can be crossed kapag if you are active on social media or on even on mass media and giving legal advice. So it may be a form of solicitation. But marami naman din existing, di ba? Maraming mga radio programs giving legal
Yun nga eh.
advice. But as long as well, case to case basis yan, parang moral turpitude. As long as ma-justify mo that you're not soliciting clients, then pwede sigurong sabihin na hindi siya violation on legal ethics. YouTube and social media medyo tricky kasi walang walang editorial standards eh, walang editor na mag-check ng ng content. So free for all yan. That's why very tricky in social media.
Any final questions, Mark? Thank you very much, attorney. Do you have some advice to give to those who want to be lawyers, new generation of lawyers, to citizens in general, and about the future of our democracy? Any final thoughts, parting thoughts that you want to share?
Well, if you love the law, I mean, those who may be interested to pursue the study of law, if you love the law, I mean, if it's something that interests you, the study of law is not something that you take up on a whim. It's very difficult. It's 4 years of your life. So if you're really interested, then I would encourage especially more women to be taking up law. To the public, it's election time, and all I can say is I hope we will vote wisely, because the future of our country, the future of our children, and the future generation will hinge on our decision on May. So I hope we vote wisely.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for that, attorney. Just let me smuggle this in. What do you have to tell to some of the younger lawyers who are looking around and seeing a lot of acrobatics, mambo jumbos? Should they still have hope in the legal profession and our judicial institutions after everything that we discussed a while ago? Bakit dapat may pag-asa pa rin?
Yes, definitely. Because if we will leave lawyering to the unscrupulous people there, then lalong we have to make sure that the people in the legal system are the scrupulous ones. So if you want to change the system, be part of the system and make changes from within.
Yes, thank you very much. So do not abandon the field to the bad ones, right?
Exactly.
Stay there. I know stressful yan, but please stay there. We need you there. All right. Maraming salamat. Thank you very much, Attorney Star Elamparo, senior partner with Divina Law, for giving us that overview of the legal architecture governing our democracy, our election process in a completely non-partisan, objective way. Thank you very much for that, attorney. Hope to have you again with us in the future as more election developments come in. We'll be very happy to have your points of view. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Richard. Thanks, Mark.